Okay, so it says we're live this time. Is it coming up on your end?
No, not yet.
Okay, people are coming in.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So sorry about that, guys. That was on YouTube's end, so far as I can tell. Our internet was good. Brianna's internet was good. I tried to re-upload it. It said I went live, but it didn't acknowledge on our phones. And then also, when we tried to load it again, it froze. So it does look like we're back. We're gonna kind of just start off where we took, pick up where we left off.
Sorry. Sorry.
So if anybody wants to come back, that'll be great.
And I screenshotted.
And Brianna did a good job screenshotting the questions. So we're just going to start off in a little bit. People are starting to filter back in. Again, apologies, guys, for that. We had some good questions so far. I'll just recap some of them. If you weren't here, we had a great question about how the NDP needs to do more to attract Green voters. And I suggested that's very true, but they kind of got to just keep plugging away. We talked a little bit about how the NDP's candidate situation is actually pretty good. We talked a little bit about, the general state of the race. We talked about my appearance on the Michael Brooks show. So Brianna's got some questions lined up, and we're going to kind of crawl back into those when some people start showing back up. So we got 5 people here. Do you want to just wait a couple seconds, or what do you think, Bri?
I think let's go ahead. So I have a comment here from Guillaume, who says he wants to tell you that there's a good YouTube channel for Quebec youth. It's called RAD. And it's like basically an hour with all the party candidates. And the NDP is pretty solid in the interview, so you can maybe look that up later.
Okay, yeah. I've seen some of their links pop up in my suggested feed. I haven't watched them yet, but I guess I should. Yeah, it sounds great. Yeah.
Okay. So I hope Guillaume was there to hear his comment, but maybe he'll come back. So Lisa Hildebrand says that she's thrilled Jagmeet Singh has put the housing crisis and clean drinking water for Indigenous people on the agenda. Today, Nikki Ashton tweeted out that she saw moss on the walls of a supporter's house.
Yeah, I mean, the housing crisis in Indigenous communities is really a tragedy, right? And I mean, Lisa, thanks for leaving your comment here, for letting us know they still work. Yeah, it's really awful. It's really awful. It's a travesty for a supposedly quote unquote first world nation to have so many of its people live in such poor conditions, and for those people to be the first peoples on this land makes it all the worst. And I think that there's a tendency sometimes to ignore Indigenous communities because they can be isolated, or because they, on the grand scheme, only form a small part of the Canadian population. But if we're going to talk about justice, then on every issue we have to have the lens on Indigenous people. So when we talk about healthcare, we have to be cognizant of Indigenous people. And when we talk about housing, we have to be cognizant of Indigenous people. And I have to say that Justin Trudeau hasn't done that. And of course, Justin Trudeau is not the first. Previous prime ministers have been much the same. But the reality is that, the NDP in this recent parliament tried to put forward a piece of legislation to build housing in Indigenous communities, a housing program specifically for Indigenous Canadians and First Nations. And the Liberals and Tories joined up together to block it. And I don't know why they did that, but they did. And so I'm really happy to see Jagmeet is not ignoring First Nations people and their concerns. Because again, if we're going to build reconciliation, it's going to take a real partnership. And of course, we're not going to solve all the issues on day one. And I'm sure, I know this, that even the NDP's plan for Indigenous people will not be enough. Like, there are some fundamental issues. But I'm glad that Jagmeet Singh is at least willingly having this dialogue and doing so in, I think, a more meaningful way than Justin Trudeau.
Okay, Todd Buckingham, hope he's back in, says, almost everyone in my family is voting Green in BC, including 2 who are typically Conservative voters, one who is 96 years young. I'm trying to convince them the NDP is a better choice.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it's, I've always said this, you vote the way you want to vote. You know what I mean? So, like, if they're really set on the Greens, then they're going to vote Green. But, ask them what matters to them. And if they are voting green for the first time ever, I might assume it's about the environment. So ask them, say, and don't attack the Greens in doing this. Say like, yeah, the Greens do have some good ideas on the environment, but like, what about the environment intertwining with the bigger picture? And when you connect it to housing and you connect it to workers' rights and you connect it to green jobs, and you might say to them, look, the Greens are clearly better than the Liberals and Conservatives on climate, but think about the NDP, because the Greens are sort of just talking about climate change and they have other issues, but they're not always intertwining them. But what about the NDP talking about building green jobs for the future generations, so that it's not just we have to decarbonize and then we all become poorer? It's what kind of economy can we build? What kind of society can we build when we decarbonize? And maybe they'll be intrigued by that. Of course, I don't know. They might not like that. But if I was going to go to a green voter, that would be my pitch to them. Like, the NDP has green issues, but also other issues too.
Okay, Mitch Hoskins says, can the NDP win over first or second choice PPC voters, or are their views too noxious to sway?
Whew, that's a good question. There are some PPC voters who I assume were NDP voters. Some of those people switched over because, they just want to vote for something different. Some people are ideologically eclectic, let's say. Some people maybe like the presentation of the NDP, but they think that Maxime Bernier is like a regular guy standing up for other regular guys, and they like that ethos, and so they don't think the NDP is doing that. Some of those people don't like the fact that the NDP leader has a certain skin color and is of a certain religion. I don't know if that's the majority, but there's some of that. And so, depending on why they left would depend on if they could come back. I have to say that flipping PPC voters probably isn't a priority. I think the NDP's goal has to be flipping liberals in those core liberal NDP ridings, followed by maybe conservatives in some of those ridings, and then Greens, especially in southern BC, where the NDP and Greens are directly competing with one another for seats. And so the PPC in some really, really close races, I guess, being able to take a PPC voter or two could matter, but I don't know if it's the priority right now for the NDP to be focusing on PPC voters.
Okay, and just a reminder, guys, I'm reading questions from the old chat. But if you have new questions or a new topic that you'd like Christo to discuss, please just write it in the chat and we'll read it out.
Yeah, again, sorry for that, guys. I have to believe it was on YouTube's end, because we never lost internet connection here. So yeah, we'll keep going.
Okay, so we have a really good question here from Claudia Holding.
Okay, great stuff. A lot of these people are my patrons. Thank you so much for all of you guys, for all you do, and for the great questions.
Okay, they say, I'm curious if it's a problem for the Green Party to actually be a part of a minority governing coalition if they don't whip votes. Doesn't this become a problem if they can't deliver on their vote?
I think that's a great question, Claudia. That's actually fantastic. I would say yes, because if we look at the seat predictions now, it's likely the case that the NDP and Liberals are right on the precipice of 170. And of course, 170 is the magic number. If you're above 170, it means you can do a majority. And if you're below, it means you can't. And so if the NDP and Liberals say add it up to 168, 169, or maybe even 170 on the dot, it doesn't leave a whole lot of wiggle room. And you could say, well, just bring in the Greens. They'll probably win 2 or maybe 1 to 4 seats. And say, welcome aboard. But as you know, their inability to whip votes will affect them. With the NDP, you could say, the Liberals could say to the NDP, okay, here's what we want. Here's what you want. We're willing to give you this. We're not willing to give you that. In exchange for supporting our government, we expect you to vote on our budget and blah, 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 blah. And reasonably so, Jagmeet Singh could expect each of his MPs to vote with him. The same can't be said for Elizabeth May. And so I think when she does go to another party to negotiate, she's going to have to either be honest with them and say, look, we can have this negotiation, but at the end of the day, my people vote how they want to vote. Or she'll have to sacrifice her values a little bit and say, on these core issues, the ones that we've negotiated, I will whip votes. So whenever the government is at stake, Elizabeth May might say, we're whipping these votes. which will be a contradiction of Green values. So I do think it limits the Green Party's ability to be part of a coalition. But I think the biggest factor, honestly, will be that they likely won't win a whole lot of seats. Because let's say even the NDP and the Liberals add up to 166. That's not enough for a majority. But if the Conservatives are in the 140s and the Bloc has about 15, it might be the case that, the Conservatives could have more seats with the Bloc, but I don't know if they'll form a formal coalition with the Bloc. And so the NDP and the Liberals don't necessarily need to add up to 170 to govern. They just need to add up to more than what all the other parties put together could reasonably expect to work on an issue on. So unless there's an issue that could unite the Greens and the Bloc and the Conservatives and the PPC, if the PPC does win their one seat, then they could probably be fine. But yeah, I think the Green Party's caucus strategy is a big limitation on their ability to play kingmaker or queenmaker.
Okay, Joe Mahalik says, would you agree that Singh took a third way between Corbyn, Sanders, and Ashton route and the traditional Mulcair ideas? I support and campaign for the NDP, but I find them lacking in radicalism.
I mean, yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think that the Singh approach likely is more moderate than what you're seeing from Ashton and Corbyn. On Sanders, it's some issues he's more progressive and some he's less. I mean, yeah, I would agree, but I think it's definitely, as you know, a leftward spin, not only from the Mulcair years, but I would say from the Leighton years, the McDonough years, and the McLaughlin years. This is the most left-wing the NDP has been since Ed Broadbent, and maybe even more left-wing in some ways than the 1988 Ed Broadbent. Certainly not the 1970s Ed Broadbent, though, or the 1970s David Lewis, Tommy Douglas, etc. Those were much more radical times for the NDP. But yeah, I'm generally happy with his vision. I think it largely sticks to ideas that Canadians find palatable and popular. Could he have been more ambitious? I think that's a fair point. For instance, I think he should be talking about nationalizing a telecom. I think that, we should be talking more directly about abolishing not just abolishing interest on student loans, but wiping out student debt and making university free. These are things I would like to see, or at least movements on there to say we're going to make university free and we're going to wipe out half of all educational debt. Something really bold. We didn't see that, though. So I am somewhat disappointed, but on the whole, this is the most progressive platform a federal party has offered in this country since the Cold War. And so I think we have to realize that sometimes baby steps are needed. And we have to also realize that, again, Bernie Sanders has never run in a general election. He is running a primary. And so it's more accurate to compare Bernie Sanders to what Nikki Ashton ran in as a primary than it is to compare Jagmeet Singh to Bernie Sanders, who Jagmeet is running as a party leader. But of course, compared to Corbyn, this doesn't have the radicalism. But another factor is, and I'm not one to defend Canada and be one of these people who's like, Canada is so great, but we never had the collapse that we saw in the US and Britain. And Canada doesn't have the strict levels of inequality that you see in the US and Britain. So there's not as much of a backlash. So it's harder for a left politician here because people think, accurately or not, that things are relatively okay in Canada. So it makes it harder to take a, tear it all down approach.
Okay, so we're on to the new chat, everyone.
We're on to the new chat. Those were questions that we were filling out from before. They were really great, so we wanted to make sure we didn't miss them. If we did miss one, please ask it again.
Yeah. So we're on to the new chat, and Lisa says, David Dole, Rational National, is having his verification taken away by YouTube. Is your channel safe from YouTube's new decision? Well,
the good news is, for me, is that my channel is far too small to be considered verified. So we don't have that issue. I think to be verified at the minimum, you need 100,000 subscribers. And so I have about 4,600 or 4,400 or so, but I don't have nearly that many. So this doesn't affect me. And from what I've heard, I think there's been an update. Everyone who's currently verified won't be affected by the new changes. You want to look into this. I think that there was enough outrage by people like David and others that YouTube sort of backed down on their decision. I think it was sort of unfair what they did. David obviously should be verified. His channel is of high quality. Because it's a news channel, especially, you want to make absolutely sure no one's impersonating either his personal brand or the channel's brand. And as some creators have noted, some of them go by their names. Like David goes by the Rational National, but I go by Christo Aivalis. But imagine if my name was like Joe Smith. You know, it would be very important to know which one is the real one. Who's the real Joe Smith? Who's the one that does the news coverage? And so I think the verifications are very important. And I think that, you know, taking it away from people like this was such a bad move. I don't know. I think they've backed down, but the question will remain, what about new people who are coming up to 100,000 subscribers? Will the process be closed off? This is sort of like how Twitter for a while had a verification process, but then and you could apply to be verified, but now you can't, and it's very hard to be verified by Twitter. So I've always been like, how can I get that blue check? And it's very hard now to do it. You have to sort of be a special person to get it. And they did that because a lot of people saw the verification mark on Twitter as an endorsement by Twitter. So then you had some people who had very, very troubling views with blue check marks, embarrass Twitter. So they've scaled back the program. So I don't know how it's going to affect things, but I do hope David and all the other good progressive journalists on YouTube get to keep their verifications.
Okay, Quinn M asks, how are parties still allowed to exist if they endanger the life quality of such a large population and allow people to remain homeless?
Well, the reason is because voters allow them to exist. I mean, that's in our democracy. You know, people vote for who they want to vote. Whether they vote out of fear, like I vote for this person to stop that other person, or whether they vote for the parties they like, or whether they vote for the party they vote for because their parents voted for that party. Like, no matter the reason, people vote for these parties. And even though these parties can do, in many cases, awful things and harm people and neglect people and drive us backwards or prevent us from going forwards, in a democracy, if people support them, they get to keep existing. And I mean, that's the reason, right? I mean, people vote for them. And some of that is based on the fact that people believe in those parties, and some of it's just inertia. Parties that exist for a long time often get to keep existing. And so that's where we're at. I mean, it's very frustrating. You're right that there are political parties out there that do not have the interests of the common person at heart. But as long as they can continue to get votes from common people, they'll survive. And it's as sad as that.
Okay. PTD GoGo 99 says, have you seen the sharing of the August 29 ECOS poll on Facebook by NDP supporters to justify strategic voting for the Liberals? I find it ridiculous that my friends are buying into this.
Yeah, that was really bad. I mean, I don't know if I've seen NDP share that. I did see the narrative, and if you look at the I believe it's Canada polling or Canadian polling, I forget the specific name. It's a account that sort of runs all the polling information, and it kind of tweets it out and gives updates, being very mad at people because they took their graphic of that August 29th poll and shared it around. And he basically said, look, this is like misusing my work, and I want you to stop. Not only is talking about strategic voting this far out from an election really bad because the polls could shift so crazily so quickly, but you know, to use data from August 29th now is misleading at best, and it's lying at worst. So if anybody's doing that, please stop. And of course, that ECOS poll was amongst the worst the NDP has seen in 20 years, right? And that poll was wrong. And Main Street both have, but the most recent releases by ECOS and Main Street have the NDP above 10 or at 11 or 12 or so. Now, those aren't great numbers, but there's been a quick bounce back for the NDP in those bottoming polls, showing that the NDP is likely closer to its average 13 to 15, and those polls are moving up to catch up. So that's where we're at with that. And it has to also be said, I noted this, I think, on the stream just before it broke, the first one, that ECOS is suggesting that numbers they have filtering through right now are showing that the NDP and Greens are continuing to rise, showing that, you know, understanding where the electorate is right now doesn't make sense. It's you can't do that off polls from August. And finally, again, it has to be noted that even if you're a strategic voter, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of ridings in this country, upwards of at least 70 or 80, where the NDP is the strategic choice, either to defeat Liberals to help bring a minority, or because there are ridings in the country which are NDP conservative swing ridings, especially in the West, but also in certain industrial towns like Oshawa. So voting NDP is the right thing to do in many, many ridings, even if you are a strategic voter. So yeah, I have no time for those things. And again, a lot of Liberals are sharing this stuff around because they're scared, because their prime minister did a racism, because the SNC Lavalin scandal, because of all of their deceit over the last 4 years, and now they have nothing to run on. So as I noted in my video today, they're just copying NDP policy without doing the work, and they're trying to hold all of us hostage, saying you got to vote Liberal to stop the Conservatives. And like, I just have no time for that at all. It's very infuriating, actually.
Okay, so just FYI, Philip Van Dam says that your links on Twitter don't seem to be working. I don't know if you can fix that easily.
I could probably, what's happening there probably is that those are the old links. I could probably move to get rid of them, but then I would be doing that in the middle of the stream. Most people are going to be coming, I think, from Facebook, but I could probably share out the most recent one. Here, I'll just do that right here.
Okay. And while you're doing that, I have a question from Omar. So Omar joins us again. He's like one of our best commentators. So let's look forward to his question. Okay. Hello. For the Canadian, for his Canadian regime class, he was reading up on the foundation of the Reform Party before they joined the Progressive Conservatives. What can we learn from the Reform Party?
Well, the Reform Party was very interesting. I mean, it did merge with the Progressive Conservatives, but it sort of grew out of them. And it was a mixture of disaffected conservatives, the social credit movement. I think the big lessons from the Reform Party are that, regionalism is very important in Canadian politics, both because regional concerns can drive a lot of voters, whether it's Quebec or whether it's Western Canada or whether it's the Maritimes. And specifically, regionalism matters because if you are going to start a new political party in Canada, you almost always need to root it in a specific region. Because going back to Confederation, the Liberals and Conservatives existed from the beginning and sort of had a stranglehold. And the only time when another party got any kind of momentum was when it grew largely out of a region. Was in that first Canadian election, there was the anti-Confederates. They won almost all the seats in Nova Scotia and won seats like nowhere else. And then the Progressive Party in the 20s won seats mostly in Western Canada. And then the CCF, the precursor to the NDP, along with Social Credit, won almost all their seats in the prairie provinces, with the exception of the NDP finding success with minors in Cape Breton. The reality is that you have to grow out of a region. And that's what the Reform Party did. It also shows us the nature of the Conservative Party today. Whether or not it's romanticizing the old Conservatives, the reality is that the PCs were more moderate. And whether that's because Canadian politics, at least on economic terms, were more to the left prior to neoliberalism, or whether it's actually an ideological shift, the reality is that because the Reform Party grew so quickly, it sort of eclipsed the old Conservative Party that it split from. And when the merger happened again, what you were left with was a much more conservative party. It was more to the right of the Joe Clark, Robert Stanfield, even Brian Mulroney to some degree, conservatives of the 60s and 70s and 80s, who were actually quite left-leaning on some issues. And so those are some of the biggest lessons. So, and of course, what you can also learn is that, Western alienation really matters. And another factor is that, conservative fissures are more likely to happen when they are in power than when they're not, at least successful ones. I've talked about this before. The whole rise of the Wild Rose Party would not have happened if the NDP was in power. In an alternative universe where Rachel Notley wins, say in just before the Wild Rose formed, then the PCs never split. The conservative movement will split when they are in power and become dissatisfied with the status quo. That's what happened. The conservative government had ruled federally since the early 1980s, and the Reform Party grew out of that dissatisfaction. And then the merger happened again because the conservatives spent time out of power. And so what you saw in Alberta, again, a key stomping ground of the reform movement, was the conservatives and Wildrose split during a long spell of conservative governance, but then came back together ASAP when they realized it was the only way they could stop the NDP. And so I think another lesson about right-wing movements is that they only succeed when they are insurgents in their own time of power. This is one of the reasons why Maxime Bernier, I feel, has not gotten more momentum. Don't forget, Bernier got basically 50% of the vote in the conservative leadership race. He effectively tied Andrew Scheer. And yet, he's only brought 3 to 5% of voters over with him, rather than, say, half the Conservative Party. And that's because they're sticking with Scheer to stop Trudeau, right? Conservatives are voting strategically, a lot of potential Bernier supporters. But if Scheer was prime minister right now and conservatives were dissatisfied with him, there'd be way more people with Bernier right now, way more, maybe double, triple, and I think that's a lesson to be learned as well from why the Reform Party was so successful. It was during a time of dissatisfaction with the conservative status quo.
Okay, so question from Dan Lai. What do you think the Canadian Communist Party, which riding do you think will be their best shot?
Whew. I mean, I'm not an expert on the Communist Party, at least not modern, in the modern party. I've done some historical work on the party. My general view is, as a CCFer, as a historical CCF NDPer, I was not a big fan of the Communist Party. For instance, in the 1940s, they aligned with the Liberals to stop the CCF. They wanted workers to stop striking during the war when the NDP wanted workers to continue to fight for their rights. I mean, I was not a big historical or contemporary fan of the Communist Party relative to the NDP. Although today, I mean, the differences are like there's no Cold War anymore. There's no Stalinism anymore, right? Like not really. In terms of where their best chances are, I honestly don't know. I mean, they often run some strong candidates in Hamilton. Sometimes they have a base sometimes in Hamilton and certain parts of urban Ontario. The only places where the Communist Party has won seats federally have been in Montreal. They won one historically in Montreal, and also in rural, I believe, rural Alberta, under the Labour Progressive Party, Doris Nielsen, back in 1940, 1939. So, look to urban centers where they have a large left-wing and working class base, but the Communist Party will come nowhere near winning a seat in any riding. It's just they don't have the resources. They don't get the media coverage, whether fair or not. It's not in the cards. The parties that are going to win seats are going to be the Liberals, Conservatives, NDP, Green, Bloc, and you have an outside chance. I think Maxime Bernier is 50-50 on winning a seat. I think Jody Wilson-Raybould is probably close to 50-50 to win her seat. And Jane Philpott has a very small chance, I think, to win her seat, but much smaller than Jody Wilson-Raybould. There won't be any other parties winning seats in this election.
Okay, so there's a little bit of discussion going on in the comments about whether or not a coalition could be considered a coup. Now, remember a number of years ago when Stephen Harper told the public that basically coalitions were like people trying to steal the government.
Yeah.
So why don't you talk a little bit about how coalitions work and what goes on there?
For sure. I did make a video about this a few months ago because conservatives were starting to spread this rumor again that if Scheer doesn't win a majority, but he wins the most seats, the Liberals and NDP and Greens are going to steal the government from him. And I think we have to be really clear about how our governments form. We elect our members of parliament. I know that I know that the way our politics work is that we vote for leaders. I know that the leaders matter so much, but at the end of the day, when you go into the voting booth, unless you live in Burnaby South or Papineau, or I think one of the Regina ridings where Scheer, you know what I mean? Unless you live in a leader's riding, you don't get to vote for a leader. I'm going into that voting booth to vote for Barrington Walker of the NDP here in Kingston and the Islands. And I'm hoping to send Barrington to Parliament. So the way it works is after an election, the prime minister is still the prime minister until otherwise stated. So technically, Stephen Harper, when he lost that election in 2015, was prime minister. He could have gone to the governor general and said, look, I want to try to form a government, but the governor general would say, no, you don't have the seats. That's a clear-cut case because there's a majority. But what about in a minority parliament? You can, let's say Scheer, or let's say Trudeau wins 10 seats less than Scheer. He can go to the governor general and say to her, Governor General, I think I can still form a government. And she will likely give Trudeau the chance to try because he's the current prime minister. And then how it works is he just needs to convince enough of those 338 MPs to support him. And whether they come from just his party or from a combination of other parties, he can form a government. It's not a coup. The party with the most seats is not given, it doesn't have the God-given right to form government. It's which party, which leader can command the confidence of the House of Commons. And if they can do that, then they will be premier or prime minister, depending on the jurisdiction. And so we saw this in British Columbia. Christy Clark won the most seats, was given the right to try to form a government, couldn't do it because the NDP and the BC Greens formed a coalition. She called Parliament back into session, or the legislature back into session, because she was still premier, and then was voted down. And then the Governor General could either at that point call an election, or because there was just an election, she goes to the opposition leader and says to him or her, can you form a government? And John Horgan said, I can form a government. And he did, and he has. And so in this situation, saying Andrew Scheer wins a plurality of seats, but not a majority, he does not automatically get to be prime minister until he can prove he has confidence in the House. It's as simple as that. And often the current prime minister, even if they don't have the most seats, will be given the chance to try to form a government, at least hypothetically. Although if it's impossible, custom dictates that they won't even try.
Well, it's kind of a complicated situation, right? Like it's not as straightforward as one might think, because you won the majority of seats, obviously you form government. So I can see why people wouldn't necessarily understand exactly how coalitions work.
Well, and even just let's look at the BC example. And this is one of the reasons why, short of proportional representation, minority governments can sometimes be better representative. The BC NDP and BC Liberals effectively tied in that election. Like, their vote totals were super close. The Liberals got a little bit more and a couple more seats, but they were effectively tied. And if the Liberals would have gotten one more seat, they would have gotten absolute power with 40% of the vote. But with the NDP having to form a coalition with the Greens, it means they get power, but they represent 55, 60, almost 60% of the vote, but in that coalition, that soft coalition. And so that's representative of a majority of the electorate. Now, not everyone's happy about every decision the BC NDP, BC Green team make. Some Greens are unhappy and some NDPers are unhappy, but it better represents the electorate than a majority government would. So no, a coalition is not a coup. It is a perfectly legitimate form of government under our parliamentary system. It's not something that happens often in Canada, but it is something that is perfectly legitimate, 100%. The biggest party does not get the right to govern automatically.
Okay, so I'm going to break the line of questions, guys, because I see some come up about this particular topic. Okay. So Iron Firehorse says, why did the Governor General have to meet with the Queen when Stéphane Dion, Gilles Duceppe, and Jack Layton wanted to form a coalition in 2008?
Well, at that time, and that was a really interesting decision, and I'm not a constitutional expert and I'm not a lawyer. There was actually...
Because the Great Dominion also puts, because Stéphane Dion was not prime minister in 2008.
Yes. And so what happened in that case was Stephen Harper was prime minister in a minority parliament. And there was concerns that he was not going to do enough to take Canada through the recession. And so the NDP and Liberals were going to form a coalition. The Bloc was not going to be part of the coalition because this was actually going to be a real coalition. Not what's happening in the BC parliament where it's like it's an NDP government upheld by the BC Greens. This was going to be a real coalition where the NDP, like this was going to be the first real coalition in modern Canadian history. The Bloc was just going to vote with them to uphold the government. The Bloc was going to be like an outside partner, just there for the votes. And what happened is that Stephen Harper went to the Governor General before they could go to Parliament to vote the government down and prorogued Parliament. And the Governor General gave in to his request. Now, he couldn't have prorogued indefinitely. Eventually, he would have had to come back and face the music and be voted out. But what happened was the Liberals got cold feet because they forced out Dion and put in Ignatieff, and the Liberals backed away from the coalition. The NDP and the Bloc were still willing to do it, but the Liberals voted to keep Stephen Harper in power once they changed leadership, and that's where the coalition idea died. Stephen Harper waited out the coalition because Dion was in, but the next Liberal leader wasn't, and we got Stephen Harper for another 3 more years. So Harper could have been done and dusted in 2008 if the Liberals hadn't backed out.
Okay, so just to be clear, the Governor General at the time went to the Queen to give permission to prorogue Parliament.
No, the Governor General, we don't,
so they didn't have to go to the Queen.
No,
maybe that's a misunderstanding.
Yeah, in Canada, you don't really have to go to the Queen for anything. Technically, in some ways, it's like the Governor General is appointed by the Queen, but on the advice of Parliament. But in effect, the Prime Minister and his cabinet appoint the Governor General, and they are the final arbiter. So when an election is called, the Prime Minister goes to the Governor General, and they drop the writ, and the Queen is not consulted. In Britain, it's different because they don't have a Governor General, because the Governor General is like the Queen.
Is the Queen's representative
in Canada, and in other Commonwealth countries, they have the equivalent of a Governor General. So what you just saw in Britain, with the big news in Britain, where Boris Johnson went to the Queen to prorogue Parliament, she agreed, but then it was all done under false pretenses. So the Parliament got unprorogued, is why he went to the Queen directly in Britain, but we don't have to do that here. No.
Right. So in fact, no one went to the Queen. They just went to the Governor.
They just went to the, Stephen Harper went to the Governor General and asked her to prorogue Parliament. Now, they don't always have to listen. For instance, Christy Clark tried to do something like this, but the governor, the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, did not listen. And I think the difference is that was right after an election, whereas Stephen Harper's was not right after an election.
Okay. So going back to the question order, Craig Adolfi says, as a prairie lifer, I'm completely baffled as to how the Bloc could be regaining seats. What is their appeal?
Well, I mean, the Bloc's appeal are for not just, certainly people who are sympathetic with separatism will always potentially give their vote to the Bloc. And separatism isn't what it was in the 1990s or 80s or what have you, but there's still some people in Quebec who are separatists. But even if you're not a separatist, you might be, of the mindset that you want Quebec to have greater autonomy within Canada. And so you feel the Bloc is the best party to get that for you. And so you can give your vote to the Bloc. Or even in a general sense, they're seen as a Quebec interest party. You're sending somebody to Parliament that's going to be there for you and for Quebec, because that's going to be, and no one else. And so that's the appeal of the Bloc generally. Now, from what I've heard, their new leader, Blanchette, is a good politician and people like him. And I think that's one of the reasons they're finding some growing success. I think there's also some dissatisfaction with Justin Trudeau. And I think that in some of these ridings, not all of them, but in some of these ridings, they don't like, again, the skin color of the NDP leader or the religion of the NDP leader. And so if you don't like voting for the Conservatives or Liberals, and you want a party that's generally, I would say, on the center left generally, then you might want the Bloc. But you have to look, the Bloc's success is very segmented. It's very strong amongst Francophones right now, but not at all amongst Anglophones. So, the Bloc could pick up some big seat gains in rural Quebec. And so a lot of those ridings that voted NDP in 2011 were actually former Bloc seats. And so they might go back to where they always were.
Okay. Vote for Daddy says, I saw a video of some lady yelling at Jagmeet Singh, calling him a Muslim and suggesting he was a traitor. Is that kind of bigotry common in Canada, and do you see it hurting him in the election?
That video was from a couple years ago. And to set the context again, that video was from 2017 when Jagmeet was running for NDP leader. He was competing with, there were some other people, but the final four were Jagmeet Singh, Nikki Ashton, Guy Caron, and Charlie Angus. And Jagmeet was holding an event, for his supporters, trying to get people to support him for leader. And a person from a, right-wing group came and attacked him as being Muslim and things like that. And that didn't hurt Jagmeet. That was a big moment in propelling Jagmeet to the leadership. He might have still won without it, but it was a moment that was a global moment, wasn't it?
The love and courage moment?
Yeah, that was like the love and courage moment. And what was crucial there was how Jagmeet stood brave and strong against this clearly hateful person. But also what was really crucial is how he didn't, say, well, I'm not Muslim. A lot of people really responded to that because in that moment, Jagmeet wanted to make it clear that there's nothing wrong with being Muslim. There's nothing wrong with being an Islamic person. There's nothing wrong with that. And so by him, just talking about welcoming everybody and being an opening and welcoming society, we can challenge hate like this. And that was a moment that drew international attention for Jagmeet. And I think it was actually a great moment for him. He hasn't had too many major hecklings. Going into the McLean's debate, a PPC supporter did heckle him. But I don't know if you guys saw this, and I made a video about this a couple weeks ago. Jagmeet's younger brother, Guratan, who's an NDP MPP, provincial member of parliament here in Ontario, was heckled at a festival in Ontario by a right-wing, right-wing nationalist who attacked him and talked about Sharia law and all of these things. It was largely incoherent. And again, Guratan never said, I'm not a Muslim and all these things, because again, it wasn't about that. It wasn't about trying to disassociate yourself from people in those moments. And that likewise got big attention. So I sort of think that these moments are awful, but I think that they showcase Jagmeet's strength and his courage and his compassion and his patience. And I think that these moments are real character moments. And I think they're good advertisements for who Jagmeet Singh is and who he could be if he's our next prime minister.
Okay. So this question is from the first stream, but not everyone was here, so I think we should do it again.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Joe Milhanick says, would you agree that Singh took a third way between a Corbyn, Sanders, Ashton route and the traditional Malcare ideas? I support and campaign for the NDP, but find them lacking in radicalism.
Yeah, I mean, to recap, because there was a question we got on the first stream. We did it early on, but I wanted to make sure that we had it correct. But here's the thing, like, I agree. Singh is to the right of Ashton and to the right of Corbyn. On Sanders, he's on some issues he is, on some issues he isn't. But the reality is that Singh is an effective campaigner. He's moved the NDP more leftward than any politician has in federal politics, at least since the 1980s, maybe even the mid 1980s. And he's done such great things in that regard that I can't be too critical. You can't break things back the other way for, too quickly. And don't forget, Bernie Sanders is still running as a primary. A general election's different. A general election's going to be different, and Singh's running in a general. So even Nikki Ashton might have had to moderate a little bit if she would have won the leadership over Jagmeet. There are some things I wish he was bolder on. I wish he was more bold on telecommunications. We should be building a national telecommunications company. Capping prices is great. It's the best plan that's available, but we need like a Canadian telecommunications corporation to provide internet and cell phone and all those things at a cheap or very cheap prices, because internet is effectively a human right in 2019 in Canada. You need the internet. We should also be canceling student debt and making university and college free. Like that, like capping the student debt interest is good. But we should be eliminating student debt 100%. But on the whole, I'm happy with the plan and I'm glad to move forward on it. In comparison to 2015, like there's so much more I'm excited about. Like this YouTube channel would have been a lot harder to run if I had to make videos about Tal Malcare. Let me tell you, Jagmeet offers way more personality wise, but also policy wise to make me excited about this campaign.
Shout out to Lisa. Thanks, Lisa, for that. And we will get to your question. Thank you. Okay, Joshua Hunt. He says, "Yo, guy, glad I caught you. Anything new and exciting in the NDP this week? I work so much that I don't have time to keep up as much as I would like."
Yeah, some new things. The NDP has re-highlighted their climate plan. They've talked about capping cell phone prices. They've released their dental care plan. Again, what some people feel should be bolder, that's another position. But I think that what's good about this one is it can be implemented effectively immediately. The NDP is effectively going to make dental care free for all households making $70,000 a year or less, and cheaper for families making up to 90. That's a majority of families in Canadian society, and it will help millions of people, and it will only cost about $1 billion a year after the first couple of years. There's a lot of great stuff. Otherwise, the NDP had a great moment where the Liberals were talking about their climate plan, and then they tweeted out, they put out a press release saying, "You bought a pipeline," and it was fantastic. Jagmeet continues to do a great job. Jagmeet, I think, handled himself brilliantly in light of the whole Trudeau scandal about those photos. Jagmeet handled himself brilliantly there. Didn't make it about himself. Didn't make it about the politics, made it about the human rights and the human dignity. And I've been really impressed with Jagmeet. Again, I didn't vote Jagmeet first on my ballot, but I've never really been like anti Jagmeet. But I wasn't like awed by him. But this campaign has gone really well, and I'm very happy to see it. The poll numbers have not spiked, but they are moving up, especially the ones that had us lowest. They're moving up rather quickly. And very, very importantly, the odds of a minority government have risen substantively in the last week. The Liberals and Tories are both going down, and that's a good thing.
Okay, Iron Fire Horse says, "If you had one question for Trudeau, what would it be?" And Free But Not Free suggests that their question would be, "How could you live with yourself?"
I mean, God, that's a great question. Like the question I would ask, I mean, it could be about electoral reform, but I know he's just going to lie to me and like try to spin it. I could ask him about the workers' rights and like, why did you violate the charter rights of postal workers? I mean, I think if there'd be one question, it's like maybe about Indigenous people, like specifically, like, why are you fighting Indigenous children in court? Like, why are you fighting rulings that have indicated that the federal government is systematically underfunding Indigenous education? And we've known that for years. And it wasn't just Justin Trudeau's fault. It's previous governments, Liberal and Conservative, but he's been fighting Indigenous kids in court for years. Charlie Angus has talked about this. Cindy Blackstock has talked about this. Indigenous activists have talked about this. Why is he fighting Indigenous kids in court to get equal educations? That would maybe be my question. And I think it's, that would have to be it. Because it really is abhorrent. Like the other things matter, but it's really heartbreaking because
like he promised consultation and then he put a pipeline through BC.
Yeah. And I mean, there's so much, like if I had to ask, and me picking that one isn't to say other issues aren't important, but I think that's one thing I would really ask him. Cause I got to feel like, undereducating children systematically, especially children from a historically, marginalized background is a cruel, cruel thing to do.
Okay. PTD GoGo 99 says, "How far do you think universal healthcare should go? Do you think services like chiropractic, physical therapy, and other manual therapy should be included in the NDP plan?"
Longer term, they certainly should. You have to look at the necessity of certain services. When does cosmetic become real? But also cosmetics can have real effects on people. So when are cosmetic needs actual medical needs? These are questions that have to be political, but they also have to be through consultation with experts, nurses, doctors, dentists, chiropractors, things like that. My ultimate vision is that if it's something someone needs to have a decent life in terms of their healthcare, then we should aim to cover it. But I also see that in a practical sense, the priority should be for those things that people need the most and which have the highest potential costs, so that people don't have to go through destitution if they have a medical need, which is why I think, pharmacare should be the number one priority, and then dental care as well. And then other things, important as they are, can maybe wait, but ultimately universal healthcare should be universal. The idea is that for me, everything related to healthcare, we should, like Jugmeat says, you never have to pull out your credit card or your debit card. You pull out your health card. And that should be the long-term vision, 100%.
Just to clarify from your last statement, Trudeau is fighting Indigenous children in court over dental benefits. Is that correct?
It's maybe, but it's also over education too. Like there's lots of stuff. And then there's Grassy Narrows. And then, there's a whole bunch. And then as was noted above, Lisa noted, I think in the first stream tonight before it conked out on us, she noted that Indigenous kids and Indigenous families are living in squalid conditions in First Nations communities. Yeah. On the biggest travesty of Justin Trudeau might be on the Indigenous profile. And here's the thing. A lot of people said you can't talk about Justin Trudeau in 2001. He's not the same man as the man in those pictures. But when I see how he treats Indigenous people, I have some real doubts. I really do.
I just wanted to clarify on the court thing.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. I got carried away there.
Next question. James Gardner says, what do you think of the new green budget plan? Do you think that it is really a factor that it is costed and balanced, or does that not really win votes?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I like the idea of the Parliamentary Budget Office. I think they do good work. I think it's important that Canadians be given as much information as they can get to make their decision. And I think costing is not the be all end all, but it can matter. Because, whether or not you vote on this issue, some people vote based on deficits. And, and again, I won't tell anybody how to vote or how to arrive at their vote. So if they want to know what things are going to cost, and the cost of parties' plans.
Sorry, everyone. I kicked the camera.
That's okay. Then I think it's important. And I do think it's troubling. It's more like it's less that I think submitting something for costing would make someone more likely to vote for you. But when you don't submit something for costing, it looks kind of fishy. It's like Justin Trudeau is not submitting a good chunk of his plans for costing. And that leads me to believe that he's not very serious about them, or he knows the costing is going to look bad, or he knows that his plan will be exposed for being half-baked or what have you. And I think that's troubling. And if we recall Doug Ford back in the last election, what happened there was that he basically didn't tell anybody his plans, costing or otherwise. And the result was that we knew he was lying to people, and he was just going to implement right-wing policies that he didn't run on once he won. And so I think the costing does give you some idea of what people are going to do. The Green Party submitting their plans to costing, I think, does give them more credibility in people's eyes, saying that, we're a real deal party. We're doing what the big parties do. We're doing all of the work in that sense. But on the other hand, I don't know if that's going to be a big winner for them, because I think the people who are voting for the Greens aren't voting for them based on stringent costing of their plans. They're voting for the Greens because they have the word green in their name and they want green policies, whether or not the Greens are the best one to give it to them.
Okay. Quinn M says, do you think it's really a good idea to try and attract voters using negative advertising against other parties, including the people and the policy, rather than stick to positive campaigning?
I mean, I've seen studies that have suggested both sides of this argument. Some people have suggested that negative campaigning works. Some have said that it doesn't. Some that said that it does in certain cases, but not in others, or that it does, but not if you go too negative. At the end of the day, you try to win votes any way you can. And one thing I'll say is that our current first past the post system, I think, incentivizes negative campaigning, because elections can be so close and can be decided on such small margins of voters that it's like at all costs you want to take voters from the other guy or other gal, and you'll often be negative to do so, or you'll create negatives to encourage strategic voting. So you have liberals, for instance, saying that Andrew Scheer is awful, and Andrew Scheer is awful, but they're saying Andrew Scheer is awful not necessarily because they think he is, because the liberals and conservatives agree on a lot, but because they want to scare NDP and Green voters and their own base into sticking with them. to defeat Andrew Scheer. So the negative politics works there. I would also suggest that in our system where not enough politicians work to increase turnout, there's a sense that you win by taking the voters of the other guys and less by getting people out to vote. But, if only 60, 65%, and that's probably a little high, actually vote, then you don't really need to take other people's voters. You could, I think, do really well by increasing turnout amongst young people and marginalized people, poor people, to get them to the polls. And I think that you could do that more through positive stuff, going to those communities and saying to them, hey, we're actually going to do something to make your life and the life of your family and the lives of people in your neighborhood better. And here's how we're going to do it. But we need your vote. We need your help. Can you please help us? And I think that's a positive message that can work. I think under proportional representation, you would see less negativity, not no negativity, but less. Do you guys remember at the Victoria Pride Parade, where at Victoria or Vancouver, where Elizabeth May, Justin Trudeau, and Jagmeet Singh marched together? And that was really nice to see. Of course, Andrew Scheer was not there, unsurprisingly. But my whole vision there was like, if we had proportional representation, Scheer and May and Trudeau would be working together at least a good amount of the time. And whether or not we like Trudeau or we like May or we like Singh, the reality is that like that cooperation would be there, and that they would have to cooperate more. And because you would know that there would almost always be a minority government, you would never want to burn your bridges with a potential partner, because you know that the next government's going to come around and you'll likely need them to support you. So or you'll need to, if you want power as a smaller party, you'll need to be able to offer your seats to a bigger party. So I think that our first past the post system make things more negative, but even within it, we could do more positive.
Okay, shout out Joshua Hunt. Thanks for your support. And you always watch our streams and ask questions. Yeah. So thank you so much. We will get to your question. Okay, Maticus333 says, is the Bloc technically a social democratic party? And if so, why isn't the NDP replacing them as a more natural party for Quebec?
There's a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, I would say that on economic issues, they are the most left-leaning party except the NDP. On social issues, it's complicated. On some, they're left-leaning, and on some, they're more right-leaning. We could do an analysis of the Bloc someday, maybe, but like the reason why the NDP hasn't replaced them, there's a whole bunch of the NDP never had success in Quebec until Jack Layton in 2011. Every once in a while, the NDP elected, we elected Tom Mulcair in a by-election in 2008, I believe. We elected, random provincial MPs, and at times the CCF, for instance, in 1944. Elected a member of the National Assembly at the provincial level at the time. But for the most part, we've never had success there. So the Bloc has always been that party. And also in Quebec, you add the additional matrix of nationalism. So Quebec has left-right economic, left-right social, but also left separatist to federalist. And then also autonomist versus centralist. And all of those things determine your vote. So just because somebody has a social democratic viewpoint, they might not be interested in voting for a federalist party. Or because of the traditional roots of the Bloc Québécois, they might vote for them. Or they feel that the NDP it has too much of an Anglophone air. There's a whole bunch of reasons why people support the Bloc. In 2011, they went to Jack Layton because he liked them, or because they liked Jack. Because he was Quebecer, he did originate in Quebec. I think that helped. He's an Anglo-Quebecer, but a Quebecer nonetheless. He was not a separatist, but Jack recognized the particular needs of Quebec. And for whatever reason, I think people weren't high on Duceppe at the time, and they wanted something different. And things are a bit different here in 2019. So look to the Bloc to recover. And of course, I don't like that because it likely means NDPers are going to lose seats, although I don't think we'll lose all of our seats in Quebec. But it looks like we are going to lose some. But if the Bloc is strong, it might prevent a Liberal majority. And in that case, the Bloc might be a good thing.
Okay, Lisa Hildebrand says, "What is wrong with Elections Canada? They tweeted out, 'Are you registered to vote in the federal election? Canadians do not need to register ahead.'"
Yeah, Lisa, and thank you so much for the super chat donation. It's very much appreciated. You know, the support from all you guys is fantastic. I really love it. It helps to drive this channel, the quality and the quantity of content on this channel. So thank you so much for that support. But you're right, 100%. I get their intent. I don't think they're trying to mislead people. If you register to vote, it makes voting quicker and easier. And if you register, it means that it's, you know, if you have issues with IDs, it makes it easier to get into the polls. But you're 100% right that it's creating a narrative that if somebody doesn't register, they'll feel like they can't vote on voting day. And again, for anybody here who's a Canadian, I want you to know that you just need to go to the polls. You can bring almost any form of ID. And even at the end of the day, if you don't have any identification, you can often get somebody you know to vouch for you. I don't want to give the specifics on the rules because you should go to Elections Canada to check that out. But I want to let you know that it is very, very easy to vote in this country. You like, we are not like in the United States, there are some places where you cannot register on election day. That is absurd to me. Everybody should be able to go to the polls on election day and vote, whether you're registered or not. So you know how that card you get in the mail, that like voting card, that makes it faster for you to vote, but you do not need that in any way, shape, or form. So go to the polls, even if you're not registered, 100%, and demand your right to vote. You are entitled to it. Yeah, you're right, 100%, Lisa. Like that's really, they got to clarify that. I think Elections Canada really does need to clarify that.
Okay, Comrade Internet says that he'll admit he had his reservations about Jagmeet, but he's happy he's taken the NDP as far left as he has.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. And I think a lot of people had reservations of his campaigning. And I think they're, at least right now, being proven a little bit wrong. Of course, the campaign's early, but I think Jagmeet's had a great start. And if he keeps going like this, I think that the NDP is going to move up in the polls and could have a very strong election. Like, I don't know what the ceiling is. It could be the sky could be the ceiling, but I certainly think, getting into another 7 or 8% isn't impossible.
Okay, some guy says, how does Jagmeet compare to other progressives I'm more familiar with, like Bernie Sanders in the US or Jeremy Corbyn in the UK?
I would say he's to the right of Corbyn. And on Sanders, he's on some issues, he's to the right. On some issues, they're quite similar. There's different contexts there. I think the difference with Bernie, and I've noted this before, is that, yeah, there are some issues where Singh should be bolder. Bernie's planning to abolish like student loans. Singh should be doing the same. I think, though, that the biggest difference, and Singh has changed this a little bit, is that Bernie is more vocal about class conflict. Bernie is very much like, I want to end billionaires. Jagmeet doesn't talk like that. Jagmeet's like, we want to make them pay their fair share. And I don't know if that manifests in a crazy amount of policy difference all the time, but the rhetorical differences are very, very apparent. And I'm much more of a fan of Bernie's rhetorical style, but it's also the case that Jagmeet is who he is. And if his personality doesn't match that way of talking, then you don't want him to force to be a different person either. So I think one thing, though, is that in the last few months, Jagmeet has become more willing to talk about the rigged game, how he's fighting against the powerful, how he's fighting for the many, and he's kind of being inspired by Corbyn and Sanders more directly. And I think that's great to see.
Okay, the Great Dominion says, does the NDP have all its candidates in place now? There are only a few days left before things are locked in for the election.
The NDP is very close. They're ahead of the Liberals, for instance. Most parties are pretty much done. There's a few ridings outstanding, but they're usually ridings that are difficult for the NDP to win. And that's not to say that they don't deserve great candidates or that many of the candidates in those ridings aren't great. But it also is the case that, it's not like we're missing candidates in a lot of tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3 ridings. So we will have candidates in pretty much every riding or all ridings. The only case where a party often doesn't have a candidate in every riding is after the lock-in date with Elections Canada, somebody resigns. so technically they don't have a candidate. But that happens sometimes. But the NDP will have all 338 seats filled by the deadline, 100%.
Okay, Mitch Hoskins says, is there a way to bring broader Canadian politics to the left without having to wait for some accelerationist disaster to radicalize people?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that we have to. It's a mixture of. I think there are 3 prongs to this that need to be highlighted. One is the NDP. Finding greater success for left-wing parties, the NDP and Quebec Solidarity in Quebec is one of the ways you do it. You just make people's lives better, and you show them that the NDP plan can work. That's what you do. Another factor is the labor movement. Workers need to organize. Existing unions could be more militant, but we also need to organize more and more workers, especially in the 21st century economy, service sector, tech sector, the gig economy. When workers are organized and are militant, they will fight for social change in their workplaces and beyond it. And I think third is working just with broad progressive movements, student movements, environmentalist movements, human rights movements, movements of workers that aren't affiliated with unions, like the Fight for 15. That unions are playing a role in the Fight for 15, but fundamentally it's a movement like primarily there to benefit non-union workers. Intertwining all 3 of these kind of spheres, labor, political parties, and social justice movements, narrative, and greater cooperation of those groups and militancy of those groups is required. And I think that could make some real change that, as you know, doesn't necessarily require like another recession or something like that to happen.
Okay, With Teeth says, so Christo, do you think we could get various NDP, the NDP supporting building grassroots movements similar to some of the plans presented by Bernie? How radical do you think we can push the NDP?
I mean, I think if you want to push the NDP to be more radical, I think one thing is like getting involved in the party is pretty crucial. I mean, it's not too much to get involved and get elected to certain positions and change things. I mean, at the end of the day, anybody who wasn't happy with Jagmeet Singh winning needed to realize that he only needed to give Nikki Ashton about 30,000 more votes to make her leader. And if you could, like, if the left in Canada, the non-NDP left really wanted to make a difference in the NDP, they could have gotten their $5 memberships or $25 memberships, depending on your age and your income, what have you, and voted and made Nikki Ashton leader. So I think getting involved in the NDP is pretty crucial. I do think that one thing this party could do much better at is intertwining ourselves with social justice groups. We do this sometimes. A lot of riding associations do this. In Kingston, we do this sometimes, but it needs to be more of a priority. And I think that mobilizing NDP supporters in those social justice causes is crucial. And I've noted this in some videos. Bernie Sanders using his voter list to send people to picket lines, or Bernie Sanders warning people about ICE, coming into certain communities, or Bernie Sanders using his movement to bring awareness to people who have to come across the border to get insulin. I think these are all things the NDP could consider doing, at least over the medium term. I think that could help us and give us more credibility in certain communities.
Okay, Joshua Hunt says, the live stream seems to be helping your channel. How do you think climate change will affect Canadian politics in the future?
Joshua, again, thank you so much for the super chat. I really appreciate that. Thanks for your support now and over the past months and weeks. The live streams I think have been going quite well. This one is doing quite well. I think we were hurt a little bit by the crash, but still about 50 people here right now is very good for a live stream. And I'm glad to see people enjoy them. In terms of climate change affecting Canadian politics, it's an interesting question. Climate change is going to potentially create a polarization, force us to deal with questions that we've kind of been ignoring for a long time. Questions that have been hard questions and necessary questions that have been swept under the rug and have been left to future generations. But as the climate continues to change, those questions will become more and more immediate and less avoidable. And so when we talk about things like a Green New Deal, that's part of it, right? There's a real sense that like now's a time we have to make bold decisions. And I do worry, we haven't seen it yet, but I do worry that right-wingers will increasingly use climate issues to approach politics. They will look at climate refugees and use these systems. Some right-wingers might use climate justice and to push certain ugly politics. And they will combine questions of environmental justice with questions of white nationalism and things like that. So I do potentially see some dangers there. And I think that it's going to be increasingly difficult for the neoliberal center to hold, because the environmental crisis will also be a have to pick sides. And I think that that's going to be major effects. Another is regionalism. If it indeed is the case that we are going to move towards a post-carbon future, look to those areas of the country, specifically Saskatchewan and Alberta, to continue to be wedded to the carbon past in a way that the rest of the country is going to maybe move on from, at least somewhat. And this is going to create even bigger regional divides, not so much on language or religion or what have you, but on the question of the climate. And this is one of the reasons why Andrew Scheer is having such a weird result. Almost all the polls have him winning the popular vote, but he's losing, polling at 75 in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and he's wasting votes in doing so. He's wasting thousands and thousands of votes because his vote is too concentrated. And I think that this could be a difficult thing for the conservative movement if anti-climate justice people are largely located, and increasingly so, within those two provinces. Then it could make it very difficult for the conservatives going forward. It could give them opportunities to bring forward a right-wing version of eco-politics, but it could also make their vote increasingly concentrated in those areas where extractive industries are primary.
Okay, that atheist bastard says, Christo, loving your uploads. What do you make of the Liberal pharmacare plan in square quotes? How could the NDP contrast their plan with the Liberals?
Well, my video today talked a little bit about this. And my concern a few months ago, up until a few weeks ago, was that the Liberals would offer a plan that wasn't as good as the NDP plan, but that on the face of it would look similar and would be hard to explain to people the differences, and that would create a lot of challenges for us to differentiate. But from what I've seen, their plan is awful. I mean, it's undercosted. I think that's it's so much wedded to trying to get Doug Ford to agree to it that Justin Trudeau is proposing it now so that he can kill it after the election and blame Doug Ford and Jason Kenney for it. It's so transparently bad. Tom Walcom from the Toronto Star, and the Toronto Star is, again, generally a pro-liberal media site, newspaper, that they said, is this really it? Is this what the Liberals are offering? Is like the NDP was maybe worried that the Liberals were going to steal their thunder with pharmacare, but it turns out we had nothing to worry about because there's nothing here. There's no details. The costing is bad. They're not submitting their own costing to the PBO, and the NDP plan is just way better. And all the NDP has to say is that they don't have to contrast their plan to a Liberal plan. They have to contrast their plan to the Liberals saying we have pharmacare, but there's actually no pharmacare plan in there. And I think that in some ways this is a bit of a good thing for the NDP, because the Liberals haven't given us a challenge here like they maybe could have. So yeah, it's not great. And as I noted in my video today, the whole point here was that Justin Trudeau and the Liberals are scared. They're scared because of the scandals they've seen, and they're scared because Jagmeet Singh has run a damn good campaign thus far, and he's doing a really good job. And I think they are worried that that the NDP is stealing their thunder. And so they're proposing NDP-style policies, but doing it in a real half-assed way. And they're hoping Canadians will buy it, but I don't know if they will, because, they're not Justin Trudeau's not an up-and-coming third-party leader anymore. He's the prime minister, and I think people expect more. And I mean, I don't know if you guys saw the quote. Did you see the quote from Catherine McKenna about how when she was asked about the environmental details, and she basically said, I don't have all the details, but we just got to get through the election first? That means the Liberals are lying. They're lying about pharmacare. They're lying about climate change. They want your vote, and then they're going to ignore the issues.
Okay, TMST says, do you know why Jagmeet chose to keep his recent convo with the Prime Minister apology private?
I think there's a few reasons. I think Jagmeet didn't want to be part of a Trudeau rehabilitation tour. I think that's part of it. I think that Jagmeet understood that it's not about him, that Justin Trudeau cannot apologize to Jagmeet Singh on behalf of all the people who were hurt and offended by what happened. And I think that Jagmeet Singh realizes that even if a public apology was not couched in those terms, that it would be presented in those terms by certain elements in the media. Like Justin Trudeau apologizes to Jagmeet Singh on behalf of all racialized people. And I think that Jagmeet Singh realized that if it really was a personal apology from colleague to colleague, then keeping it private was the right thing to do. And I support Jagmeet on that. Jagmeet came out and he spoke brilliantly on the issue. He spoke beautifully on the issue. I don't know if speaking in public to the Prime Minister would serve anybody's interests. And I think having the conversation be private was probably the best thing. And who knows what they said, but I'm glad it happened. But yeah, I respect Jagmeet's decision and understand it.
Okay, Maticus333 says, as an NDP supporter, a lot of what I hear is we need to strategically vote Liberal. How can the NDP overcome this? Maybe a rise in the polls would help.
Yeah, certainly a rise in the poll will help. A few things. One, you want to explain to people that it's far too early to talk about strategic voting because we don't know what the polls will be like. Again, this far out in 2015, the NDP was either in first or second. The Liberals were in third. And so, you can't make strategic voting calls at this point in the election. Two, you want to explain to people that you shouldn't strategically vote for the Liberals, especially because they lied about electoral reform, creating a situation in which they want to hold you hostage. And I don't think it's right to reward a deceitful party like the Liberals. And I think another factor has to be known that there are many ridings in this country where you don't need to vote strategically to stop the Conservatives, at least not vote for the Liberals in every case. There are many ridings in this country where the NDP and the Liberals compete with one another, right? Like the NDP and the Liberals in downtown Toronto compete with one another. In some cases, there are ridings where the NDPs and the Liberals both got above 40 in 2015, and the Conservatives got like 10 or 15 or less, right? They got like 9 points. And the Liberals in those ridings will tell you to vote strategically, but it doesn't make sense to do so. So there was a really good tweet. I'll see if I can find it. Maybe I'll put it in the description if I can't find it. From one of my Twitter followers, put it up online, and he basically put out an example of about 75 to 80 ridings minimum where you should vote for the NDP, and you can do so without worrying about electing a Conservative. And I think strategically, you also have to tell people that any progressive, if they're truly an anti-conservative strategic voter, their goal has to be defeating a conservative majority and a liberal majority. And that means not only defeating conservatives, but that means defeating liberals and electing NDPers in their stead. So in places like St. John's East, Davenport, Halifax, Parkdale High Park, in much of southern British Columbia, in places like Niagara and London, Ontario. These are places, Kingston, Ontario, where these are places where you should be voting NDP and not Liberal. Defeat the Liberals and replace them with NDPers. Like, that's the big thing. I'm not a strategic voter, and I don't like the idea of it. I think people should vote for what they want. But if somebody is a strategic voter, you might not change their mind on that. Sell the NDP as a strategic option, and there are many ways to do that, especially if you live in certain parts of the country. Show them polling data from 2015. Show them, if they live in downtown Toronto, show them that it's impossible for Andrew Scheer to win that riding, especially given how unpopular Doug Ford is in those parts of Toronto. And prove to them and say, look, these are ridings where the NDP or the Liberals are going to win. You don't need to worry about the Tories. Vote NDP. And that's to say nothing of ridings where it's like 70% conservative or 70% liberal. There, it doesn't matter. Just vote for who you believe in. Like, there are ridings where the Liberals and the NDP will both be below 10, right? It doesn't matter who gets your vote. They're both going to lose. Vote for the one you like, and hopefully they finish second and they get more votes and the percentage looks better at the end of the day.
Okay, we have a lot of questions.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, that was me again. Ramy Ram says they want to comment on how garbage CBC vote compass is and how the Liberals use the company that makes it to distribute electoral reform. Disrupt electoral reform.
She's just kind of leaning in right here. The good thing is that our channel's getting big enough that we're getting trolls, right?
Yes.
That's great to hear, guys. We're getting trolls. It's nice. It's great to see. We're growing up. This channel's growing up. But yeah, I mean, yeah, CBC vote compass is garbage. 100%. It's absolute garbage. That the NDP, that the Greens would be put left of the NDP, especially in this election, is absurd. That the Liberals would be anywhere close to the NDP is absurd. The vote compass, the actual vote compass, like go to like votecompass.com or whatever it is not perfect, but gives a much better one. And you're right, it is the same firm that disrupted electoral reform. Although, like, I mean, they were hired to do their job. But I mean, like, yeah, the CBC vote compass is awful, and it gets policies wrong or it's misleading. If you want to point people to a vote compass, point them to the actual vote compass one, and I think it's accurate, and it has the Liberals, Greens, and Conservatives on the right wing spectrum, right wing social and right wing economic, and the Liberal and the Bloc Québécois, the NDP on the left wing social, left wing economic, with the NDP being more left wing than the Bloc, but only by a little bit, and none of the parties being left wing enough for me. But but the NDP being the most acceptable.
Okay, so A's says my riding finally got an NDP candidate about 4 or 5 days ago.
Great to see. I mean, they're all coming, right? They're all coming. And again, I know it's hard to just get your candidate now, but like all the ridings are going to get them. And again, I'm telling you guys, some of these candidates are fantastic, and you never know what's going to happen. The next Ruth Ellen Brosseau could be one of them.
Tom Parkin is here. He says, "Hey, great to catch you live."
Great, Tom. Thanks for coming by. Tom runs a great website, Game Changers, Canada Game Changers. .ca. Tom, if you want to plug your website, I don't know if it'll
they don't let you do links.
Yeah, they don't let you do links, but if you want to write it out in a way that won't show a link, you want to put like an @ symbol or something, maybe it'll come up. Go to Game Changers. They share some of my work. They have great memes. Do check them out.
Okay, random comment says, question, I have lived in conservative riding all my life, and I feel like my vote has never counted. Why should I even vote this election?
Well, you should vote because you never know what's going to happen. Voting is important. But you know, you raise an issue that I feel is one of the biggest concerns I have with first past the post, which is that in large parts of the country, voters don't have a voice. Conservatives in your riding are taken for granted because there's too many of them. And everybody else who isn't a conservative doesn't have their voice heard. And I mean, even in Alberta as a whole, almost all their ridings are going to go conservative, except for maybe Edmonton, Strathcona, which means that for the most part, conservatives will be taken for granted in Alberta and everyone else will be ignored. And look at the Maritimes. The Maritimes elected 32 Liberal, Maritimes and Atlantic Canada, you know, the 4 Atlantic provinces, elected 32 out of 32, all Liberal. Everybody else in that province got no voice in those 4 provinces, 40% of our provinces. So I think that you should definitely still go vote. It's important. But your story is just one of the many reasons why I support proportional representation. Because you could know that your vote would have that small little bit of a difference in electing an NDP MP. Under a mixed member proportional system, your riding would likely always remain conservative if it's a conservative stronghold. But when you made your regional vote, you could vote for the NDP and you could send an NDP MP to Parliament, and they could be there representing you regionally, even if your most local MP isn't. So your story is the why we need proportional representation.
Okay, Lisa Hildebrandt says, Christo, thank you for your words of wisdom, which have spurred me to assist the NDP candidates in my central Alberta riding. We have 1,600 kilometers to cover with very little money. I may run the next election.
Lisa, that's fantastic. Lisa dropped me a line a little bit ago letting me know about this, and I think that's great. Some other people have let me know that this channel has helped them get involved with the NDP, which is fantastic. And Lisa, if you want to run, I 100% think that's a great idea. If any of you want to consider running, if you haven't considered it, I want you to consider it. Maybe it's not for you, but maybe it is. And if it is for you, I want you to take the plunge, because you know it's important to bring that voice to politics and bring your voice to politics. And I think that Lisa playing a role in a campaign is going to help that campaign. And I think Lisa running next time and many of you running next time, be it in the provincial level or federal, or maybe even for city council or your municipal council, is a great idea.
Okay, that atheist bastard says, Christo, what advice can you give to aspiring writers?
That's a good question. I think my writing came mostly through academia. So if you want to write like fiction, I don't know how much advice I have. But like in terms of like my academic writing, I think one good thing is to write in different styles. I don't just write academic writing and I don't just write journalistic writing. I do a little bit of both. And I find that's good because the different writing styles can give you different skill sets and fill different blind spots. And I became a much better academic writer when I started writing newsletters for my union. And then I became more and started writing pieces for Canadian Dimension and Active History and other left-leaning websites. Those are some of my that's one big piece of advice. One thing is to create structures. I always find that a good outline is incredibly important. A good outline is incredibly important to gather your ideas, to always hammer home that thesis. Whether you're writing a 300-page book or whether you're writing a 500 or to 700 word article, having a good thesis is imperative. In terms of, the economics of writing, it's hard, right? Like, I mean, my book is an academic book. They don't sell a whole lot, things like that. But like the reality is that, trying to find some gigs that can pay you for writing is a good thing, but it's also good to look for sources that you believe in that need writing as well. I'm not suggesting anybody should give their labor away for free, but there are many small left-wing publications, for instance, where no one makes any money. And in those cases, I think that I have no issue writing for free as an act of social justice. And it's a good way to hone your skills as well. So do consider that at least sometimes. So that's a great thing to practice.
Okay, the Great Dominion asks, so why didn't Nathan Cullen run for NDP leader? Seems like he could have. Seems to me he could have been the second coming of Jack Layton.
Yeah, Nathan Cullen was a popular choice. He was, if he ran, I think he would have had a great chance of winning. I mean, you never know 100%. Some people can flop. Like everyone thought that Jeb Bush was going to be the 2016 candidate for the Republicans, and he was awful. But Nathan Cullen didn't run for a couple reasons. The biggest reasons, I think, were personal rather than ideological, or because he didn't think the NDP could do well. A lot of people said he was leaving because he thought Jagmeet was going to fail. But don't forget, Jagmeet was endorsed by Nathan Cullen. Nathan Cullen didn't endorse him. Nathan Cullen's riding is in northwestern British Columbia. It's a very big riding, one of the biggest in the country. And it means that there's a lot of work to be done in representing his people. And when he goes to Ottawa, it's a very, very, very far trek to do so. And so it's a grueling job to be an MP, but for him more than most, it certainly is. And he has a young family, and he's been in Parliament for a good while now. So I think from Nathan Cullen's perspective, it was time to take a break. I do think he'll be back into politics, but I'm not sure if it'll be federal or provincial. He might see provincial as his next route because it'll be better travel conditions. And also maybe he feels that there's a greater chance to form government provincially. But I could see him coming back federally too. He's still a young guy. I just think he needed a break.
And he has young children.
Yeah, he has young children. Like there's a whole bunch of reasons. I don't think it's because he has no faith in Jagmeet. I think it's honestly he just needed a break.
He was tired.
Yeah, he was tired. Yeah.
Okay, Mushbear1 says, usually conservatives and liberals are the only choice in my riding. I want to vote for the NDP, but I think my vote is better used for the liberal candidate. What should I do? They think if they vote for the NDP, it'll be helping the conservatives win.
Well, don't forget, there's no party that has helped the conservatives win more than the liberals. It was the Liberal Party that had a chance to end first past the post forever and then didn't. And so in a reality, the Liberal Party are the ones that will elect conservatives across this country. And the next time a conservative majority forms, it'll be the fault of the Liberals and not any particular voter who voted for the Greens or NDP or Bloc or whoever else because they didn't want to vote for the Liberal Party. So don't let them shame you into voting a certain way because you're worried about your strategic voting and things like that. Like don't let them do that. like, vote for how you want to vote. If your goal, like, again, I can't tell you how to vote. If you want to vote for the Liberals and for a strategic reason, that's your choice. But again, I would suggest that, have the Liberal Party earn your vote, and think about it that, it's your local Liberal MP. Does your local Liberal Party support proportional representation? Because if they don't, then they're the ones that are creating the situation, and you need not take blame for their deceit.
Yeah, you should always just vote your heart, right? Vote your conscience. And you should never make decisions based on a position of fear, but rather on a position of hope or strength.
Yeah, I mean, that's my position. Yeah, Brianna's 100% right.
Okay, Maticus333, counterfactual. How do you think Charlie Angus would have run this election campaign? And do you think he could have broadened the NDP base the way Jagmeet appears to have done?
This was always going to be a tricky election for the NDP, regardless of who won. Like, let's take the 4 people who ran. Each one of them, or like the 3 people who ran against Jagmeet and lost, each one of them winning would have broadened the bases in some ways, but maybe lost people on other ways. So does Charlie Angus winning help the NDP in certain areas of the country? 100%. But does Charlie Angus help us in some key urban areas? I'm not sure. Does Nikki Ashton broaden and intensify the left-wing base? Probably. But does she bring key support in all the diversity of Canada? That remains to be seen. Does Guy Caron keep big levels of support in Quebec? I think there's a good chance. But does Guy Caron lose support in certain parts of English Canada? Probably. So I think that with all of these candidates, I'm not sure if we would be in any of a better position right now. It's always a hard election for the NDP to run against a new Liberal government, because the government hasn't been in power forever. Until recently, the government's been very popular. And so it's always hard for the NDP to get oxygen in that context. And whether it was Charlie or Jagmeet or Nikki or Guy, they would be facing some of the same fundamental financial and logistical and strategic voting, all of those sorts of challenges. So I'm not sure if Charlie Angus could be doing better. I think it's plausible, but I think it's plausible that he could be facing some of the same challenges too.
Okay, Mailed Horseman says, do you think Jagmeet Singh should have a more aggressive plan on climate change? I'm a big fan of most of the NDP platform, but I would like to see slightly more ambitious emission reduction targets.
I think some people have made that point, and I don't think it's unreasonable. I think the NDP are putting forward a plan that helps us get to 1.5, and to do so while taking care of the Canadian population. I think, one, it's an act of social justice, but also it's an act of political buy-in. The only way you're going to sell a transition is to sell it as a just one. And I think the NDP plan is the one that is closest to that. So I think the Green New Deal strikes a good balance. I think more of a radical emissions reduction target might not have been palatable to voters, even NDP voters. And so I don't know if more ambition there was necessarily needed politically, although I do share the same concern that more stringency on getting us to a post-carbon future is likely needed. But I don't know if the polling was done by the NDP about how to strike a balance with their Green New Deal. But I feel the Green New Deal strikes a good balance. And I mean, the question remains, you could set higher targets, but can you meet them? And maybe the NDP thought we'd like to go to, lower targets or higher targets, sorry. But we don't think we can meet them even under the best case scenarios. And we're going to be honest with voters. And maybe that was the case too.
Okay, Rami Ram asks, how right-wing is Nathan Cullen? What work did he do in South America?
I don't know much about Nathan Cullen's work in South America. Nathan Cullen is definitely like a moderate within the NDP. So he's never really had my big support. I think he's technically a great politician. So I would say he's more of a centrist than most of the NDP right now. But I'm not sure about his work in South America. I don't know. I can't comment on that.
Okay, I had a question, but here it is. Okay. That atheist bastard says, Christo, many thanks for the live streams. Do you think the narrative of replacing Jagmeet is dead now? How impressed have you been with him thus far?
I've been quite impressed. I don't know if the narrative of him being replaced will ever go away, because, I mean, Andrea Horwath, some people wanted to replace her after 2014, and that was reasonable. But then some people wanted to replace her after 2018 without a successor in mind, with no clear indication that the labor movement wanted her out, and on and on and on. And there will always be talks about replacing leaders. Like Justin Trudeau, there's a reason now, but Justin Trudeau could win a majority government without scandal, and there'd always be a small portion of liberals who are like, we want a different leader for whatever reason. So it's not going to go away. I think that Jagmeet is in a good position to keep as leader for a few reasons. One, we turfed Mulcair. I thought that was the right decision, but Mulcair was chosen as a gamble. We're going to sacrifice some of our values to win government. And it almost worked, but then it didn't. And so Mulcair got turfed. Jagmeet is running a traditional NDP style campaign. And so if he loses, he can at least say, I lost the right way. That'll mean something to some people. Now, there are some variables. Does Jagmeet lose party status? That could put him at risk. Does he lose his own seat? That could put him at risk. But the way the polls are trending, I think he's going to be in a good position. And I think that if it's a minority government especially, even if people wanted to replace him, it'd be hard to, because with a minority, you always have to be wary of an election. And so I think that he's likely going to get another shot, at least one.
A's comments that something funny and kind of sad happened. They recognized the name of the PPC candidate running in their riding from his campaign signs, and when they looked him up, it was a guy from the high school, and they had a couple of classes together too. It's kind of weird and sad when you recognize people that you know as PPC candidates, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean that's pretty troubling, I think. At the end of the day, you can't really do too much about that. People are going to be who they are. You might not have known them like that, but maybe it shows in some ways that people we knew we didn't really know. But maybe it also shows, and I'm not going to defend PPCers, that it is important to realize that even our political enemies come from the same places we do sometimes. And I think that's important to know. Just as an off story, one of the people I know from high school would eventually become like a key Doug Ford staffer. And I always thought that was really interesting. I'm like, I recognized his name. It was something of a unique name. And so I looked him up and I'm like, no, that's definitely the guy. And I'm like, I wonder how you got from where we were to becoming Doug Ford's one of his advisors. It was always so interesting.
Corey Foster says, what should I say to environmentalist friends who are thinking Green Party is the best choice over the NDP?
Well, as I've noted, you can say to them that the NDP looks at the environment in its wider context in a way that I feel the Greens don't. I feel the NDP's Green New Deal is better in that sense. The NDP's Green New Deal really ties into, we're going to decarbonize society, but do so with a lens of social justice. And to do that, we're going to work with Indigenous people. We're going to work with workers. We're going to work with small businesses. We're going to work with industry. And by doing that, we're going to build a better society for everyone. The decarbonization will not be used as a tool to either exacerbate or lock in inequality. And I don't think I've seen that from the Green Party. That would be my number one way to convince people to pick the NDP over the Greens.
Okay, shout out to Corey Foster. Thank you for your support, and we will get to your question before the end of the stream.
Yeah, thanks so much, Corey.
Okay, next question.
Still a bunch coming in.
Yeah, there's still
you guys are great, giving us tons of material. Really appreciate it.
Well, we should go a little bit later because we
are
messed up at the start.
We are going to go a little. We'll try to go for until 2 hours maybe, and then reevaluate, see where we are.
We'll see.
Yeah.
Okay. Santok Sanini, sorry, I just messed that up so bad. Said, is Jagmeet Singh's Sikhism going to hurt or help him in this election?
I mean, for some people, it's going to hurt. There are people in this country that won't vote for people for a whole bunch of reasons. There are people who won't vote for women. There are people who won't vote for Catholics. There are people who won't vote for Francophones. There are people who won't vote for people of color, regardless of their religion. So there are some people out there who will not vote for a person who has a different religion or wears a turban or has a certain skin color. But I think that in some ways, Sikhism is a proud religion with a noble heritage, And I think that a lot of people have pointed out that a lot of Singh's compassion and courage and strength come in part from his faith. And I think that's given him a real strong resolve. And I think in some ways, Singh is continuing to impress people. And I don't know if his religion is going to be a big help, but I don't think it's going to hurt him as much as people suggested. At least I hope it doesn't.
Dip William says, what is or should be the NDP position on Iran?
Whew. I don't want to give a definitive answer because I'm not an expert on Iran, at all. But my view is like generally my reflex is that the Americans are bad. Like, it's generally my reflex. And I have to say that, like, I feel like there's likely the case that there are interests that want war with Iran more than Iran necessarily wants war with other people. But beyond that, I don't want to comment. I think that what happened in Saudi Arabia, I don't know what happened in Saudi Arabia, like in terms of who caused it. But I don't know. I've always felt that obviously Iran is not a good country. Like, it's not a good country. It's not a good guy internationally. But I also feel that Iran, for whatever reason, has always generally been sort of cornered in and maybe not given a fair deal either.
Okay, Corey Foster says, is the NDP more green than the Green Party?
I mean, that's a great question. Corey, again, thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. Thanks again for that. That really depends on certain, like, the Green Party is greener in the sense that it's part of their branding, but I think the NDP in this election has really embraced green politics. The Green New Deal, they were fighting against pipelines. I think that the NDP can make at least a credible case that they're in the same ballpark. And Elizabeth May, for her part, has sort of sacrificed certain green politics. She said she's open at least to building certain pipelines that could ship tar sand oil. So it's like, where are the Green Party and where are the NDP? And I think the NDP has, become at least as credible as the Green Party on the environment. And as I noted, better intertwining environmental issues with indigenous justice and working class justice. That's my view, though. I mean, I wrote a piece. I don't know if you guys saw it, but I wrote a piece in the Washington Post a couple months ago that talks about the NDP's Green New Deal. You guys should go check that out. I outlined some of the differences between the Greens and the NDP.
Okay, Maticus333, who is just killing it with questions tonight,
Yeah.
said, if we do end up with a minority government, how many seats do you think the NDP needs to win at a minimum to have leverage to at least get electoral reform out of the Liberals and not a referendum?
Whew, that's a good question. I think first of all, we're going to need enough seats to hold the balance of power. And I think the ability for the NDP to bargain might depend on the result rather than the number of seats. And by that, I mean, will Trudeau be less likely to bargain on big issues? Certainly, he'll give the NDP some things. But will he give them something like electoral reform if Trudeau wins again but doesn't have enough for a majority? Let's say scenario A is Trudeau ends up with 155 seats, Andrew Scheer with 145, and the NDP gets 20 seats. All of that is very reasonable. And so the NDP and Liberals are clearly over 175. But he doesn't need the NDP to stay as prime minister because maybe Scheer doesn't get anybody to work with either. So he doesn't need a bargain. But what about scenario B, where the NDP has, the Liberals get 150, Scheer gets 155, but the NDP gets, say, 20, 25 seats. The NDP could pole vault Justin Trudeau from second to first with their support. And maybe Trudeau is more desperate in that case because not getting the NDP support makes Scheer prime minister and takes him out of power. If he really wants to hold on to it, maybe he's more willing to bargain big issues. I think that's the factor to look at. Now, whether or not Trudeau will agree with the NDP on electoral reform, I don't know, but that would increase the likelihood.
Okay, that atheist says, Christo, is it fair to say that the NDP has the big momentum in the election right now? Do you think the green surge came too early?
I do think the green surge came a little early. I do think that, but I also think what happened with the Greens is that they had good momentum, and Elizabeth May had a strong spring and summer, but they started getting more scrutiny, and the Greens did not hold up well to the scrutiny. The policy book didn't hold up well. Elizabeth May really didn't hold up well. The whole inconsistencies, do they whip, do they not whip? Does the party accept anti-choice people or do they not? Do they accept sovereigntists and separatists or do they not accept them? And then the whole fiasco where they say that they took the NDP NDP members in New Brunswick and there was 14 of them, and that number went down to 8, and now it might be as little as 2, if we're being honest. Like, all of that hurt the Green Party, and I think it killed some of their momentum. So yeah, it was an issue of peaking too early, but also I think they scored a lot of own goals. I do think the NDP certainly has some momentum. The polls have not spiked for the NDP, but they have started to go up. Singh's approval ratings in general have gone up. Angus Reid had a really good chart a couple days ago that showed all the other leaders trending downward in their approval, except for Singh, who was going upwards. And I think that recent polls by Ecos has put out some recent data suggesting that the NDP is trending upwards, although they suggest the Greens are too. And something I read in Le Devoir today, just before Livestream, so I can't cite the pollster, suggests the NDP is the second choice of every party, including in Quebec. It's still the second choice, which means that if people are moving away from their existing party, maybe they're likely to come to the NDP, which shows real growth potential. So I think the momentum is good. It hasn't quite paid off yet. It's not like Singh is skyrocketing up the polls, but he's bubbling. It's like it's percolating just below the surface.
Okay, Zachary Galvine has noted that the Greens want to support the tar sands till 2050, which I believe is true. Liz May did say that.
Yeah, I mean, their position again on this is unclear. It's a mixture of, I think they want to play it both ways, but then they're also at times they're like, yeah, we want to ban tar sands. And other times it's like, well, we want to export it or refine it because it's better for the economy. And then like the answer is right now, I don't know. But I do know that at least in some part of this election, they basically took a pro-pipeline stand. It is what it is, right? Like the answer with the Green Party often is, we don't know. And of course, none of this is to say that they don't whip votes. So we actually don't know what the Green Party would do if they got enough seats to matter in the House of Commons.
Okay, James Gardner wants to know who's the person on the other mic.
The person on the other microphone is my wife, Brianna. She helps co-host this podcast. Eventually, I'm going to get her to be on screen, but this really helps me because when we have larger stream, when I first started, the streams were smaller, but with 55 people here and you guys asking a ton of great questions, it's really hard for me to do this on my own. So Brianna helps with reading the questions and offering comments every now and then. So if you haven't said hi, say hi to Bri.
Okay, Rami Ram says, what are the plans to get the left within the NDP organized to not only push the party to where it belongs, but also rile up rising social activists and radical unionists that exist yet are uninspired?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's a concerted effort. I think there are some NDP MPs and candidates that are trying to move in a left-wing direction and are part of the reason I think the platform is so bold. And so I think organizing around those folks is helpful. Matthew Green, Nikki Ashton, Sven Robinson, Jessa McLean. There's many others, but those are just a few that like have all done some really great work and like are pushing the party in a strong direction. And I think that's incredibly important. And I think it's, organizing to elect, strong people within the party is vital. Making your voice heard at conventions are important. Conventions can be a very cynical process, but also like the left wingers at convention, maybe not in the Socialist Caucus, but you'd be surprised how on certain issues they can really insert themselves and make a big difference. On the last Ontario NDP convention, our resolution on GM was awful. It had nothing about public ownership in it or anything like that. And then people got up, left-leaning people from the labor movement and from the party got up to put in a clause adding the potential nationalization of GM as something the Ontario NDP supports. And that was added in on the floor. And so that was done through organizing and just through harnessing the desire of the people in the room. So I do think there's momentum for that. And I think that one good thing you could say about Jagmeet and his leadership is there's a whole bunch of left-leaning people running and in some very winnable seats. So there's a chance that this caucus, this NDP caucus, will be more left-leaning than we've seen in a long time.
Okay, some guy said, I heard the NDP is anti-BDS. I think one Green candidate, Paul Manley, was a former NDPer who had troubles with the party because he was pro BDS. Is there any truth to this?
The Paul Manley situation is complex. Paul Manley had an openly pro-Palestine position, pro-BDS position, and didn't get vetted in 2015 and suggested that was the reason. Now, the party neither confirmed nor denied that. But there's been other things that people have talked about. I'm not going to cast any allegations here because I have not confirmed these myself. But there are, for instance, some people saying that Paul Manley believed in certain conspiracy theories about certain events, and that those might have actually been the reason he didn't get vetted. And that, yes, Tom Mulcair's NDP was far too much pro-Israel for my liking and far too much anti-Palestine for my liking. But it might well have been the case that he was not vetted because of other issues and then made it about BDS and Palestine. The NDP's position on BDS is a nuanced one. I think BDS is a good thing. I think Israel's an apartheid state, and I think it's perfectly legitimate that we not do any business and investments in an apartheid state. I 100% agree. But the NDP, it doesn't support BDS, nor does the NDP, unlike the Liberals and Conservatives, want to criminalize BDS. For instance, just recently, the B'nai B'rith has tried to get an NDP candidate de-vetted because she was involved in BDS activities, and the NDP has stood by that candidate, saying we stand by her. So the NDP's position is not anti-BDS, but it might not be pro-BDS either, if that makes sense. And the position has become, I think, better under Jagmeet's leadership, even if it isn't where it should be.
Okay, Quinn M says, why do political polls exist? And Mark Trealt, suggests it's for our entertainment.
Entertainment's a big factor. Another factor is, and whether or not you believe this, I'm not saying this is the reason, but some people suggest that maybe it's a good way to know where the votes lie, to give a good sense about where things are. It exists because it's part of not necessarily our entertainment, but part of the news as entertainment, like politics as horse race, politics as sport, politics as like who's going to win the contest and who's got the momentum and who's tumbling and who's rising. And this is great for journalists. It's great for me on YouTube, frankly. It's easy to create situations where like I can tell a story based off this poll. Some polling companies also use it as a form of advertisement. Most polling companies they don't just do political polls. They basically like do polling and research for companies and for other groups. And they sell that, and that's their business. And one of the things they do to generate advertisement and to show that they know what they're doing is they do election polling. And so it's like, look, we can do something as complex as an election. We can certainly help your small business survey customers to better understand them. And I think that's part of the process as well. So those are all the major reasons polling exists.
So shout out to Mushbear. Mushbear1. Thank you so much for your support and your great questions tonight. We really appreciate it. Okay, the next is from Zachary Galvine. Does the NDP need to adopt the language of class struggle?
I would say at least more so. They've started a little bit. Jagmeet in the last few months has been talking about like, I'm not for the powerful, I'm for the people. You know, I'm not here for the insiders, I'm here for regular folks. He went to the Canadian Club and basically told a room full of millionaires that they all need to pay more taxes and that like the people in this room have not been doing enough for society. I think though, like, yeah, Bernie Sanders' language is something I want to see a little bit more of, but I don't know if that's Jagmeet's style. So yeah, when Bernie was like, billionaires should not exist, I was like, yes, 100%. He's right. Billionaires should not exist. 100%. Jagmeet needs to say stuff like that, I think, but I don't know if he will. And again, I don't know if that's his style, right? I don't know if that's his style. Again, it's not even purely politics. It's also, or like our ideology. It's also sometimes just a matter of style.
Okay. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, Shane Barretto says, way ahead of myself, if we get a Sanders administration, do you think it will help the NDP in the next election? I think 2019 will be a minority liberal government. I'm hoping I'm hoping with NDP balance. And I know I missed a question earlier, which asked for your prediction on the election, but I couldn't find it.
The Canadian election?
The Canadian election.
Okay, so first to that question, sorry, let us know if you asked it. Brie will give you a shout out. I think that's a great question. My prediction right now is a liberal minority government. I'm not predicting that as the outcome because frankly, like it's a fool's game to make predictions right now. Like Justin Trudeau has said there's more image, like he won't say there aren't more images of what he did, right? Like there's at least 3. And so more scandals could happen to him or to anybody else. And so this election's not over. We got multiple debates left. Like it is not over. But if the election was to happen today, yeah, it's a liberal minority, and that's the most likely scenario because it looks like the liberals and conservatives are going to be neck and neck most of this election, and the liberals have better vote efficiency, so they should likely edge them out, but only in a minority. And to the question of if Bernie wins, would that help the NDP? I think it would. I think it would help the NDP because it would be proof that like an NDP style person could win. Now, would that convey the message as we would like to hear it? I don't know, but I think that would be a big moment for the left in North America, and I think that would inspire people to maybe consider the NDP more so. But again, as you noted, we're getting very well ahead of ourselves. Let's hope Bernie can win the nomination and then the presidency.
Zachary Galvine wants to know, will there be any more B and Brianna stories? And I would just like to reiterate to everyone from the last stream that the only true thing about that story is that there was a B and I was involved. The rest, Christo just completely made up in his head over the last 10 years.
Well, I mean, we can agree to disagree. There may be more Brianna and Christo stories in coming streams.
Oh.
I can't promise yes, but I can't promise no.
Oh my God. Okay. Joshua Hunt says, have you ever convinced a conservative to vote for Jagmeet Singh? What is your pitch to right-wingers?
Whew. I mean, like, okay. Like I live in like, I don't know about you guys, but I live in like a pretty like left-wing bubble. I live in Kingston, which is a liberal NDP riding. And I don't have a lot of conservative friends, if I'm being honest. Like I know so few conservatives in my actual life that like, I don't know if I've ever, like, I don't know very many. Pretty much everyone I know is an NDPer or is to the left of the NDP. And I know a few token liberals. You know what I mean? We often call them liberal, whatever their name is, because we know so few. It's like, oh, that's liberal Joe over there. He's our token liberal friend, right? And so, I mean, I don't know. My pitch to a conservative to vote for the NDP, it depends on the type of conservative they are. If they really are a budgetary hawk, say to them, look, in Ontario 2018, if they really were like, I'm a conservative who cares about deficits, say to them, look, Andrea Horwath will run the lowest deficits. And that was true. She's going to increase spending, but also increase taxes to balance them. So if they're like a budgetary hawk, tell them that Jagmeet Singh might increase spending, but he's also going to increase taxes. It may well be the case that at the end of the day, the NDP run the smallest deficits. And like, you might appeal to their sense of community. Some conservatives are like, they're really big on community and appeal to their sense about how, currently people in their community are suffering. And like, if you want to like do something good for your neighbors in your community, we need things like dental care and pharmacare. These are important things to take care of the community. And some conservatives really like that. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how many conservatives you're going to convince. One challenge is that conservatives are very, very much less likely to switch votes than the other parties. If you look at a lot of polling that asks you, okay, you're voting for party X, how likely are you to switch? And conservatives are much less likely to switch than other parties. And when you ask them about where like they are likely to switch, sometimes they suggest NDPs in some polls, but other times they would switch to other parties. So in other times, it's depending on your riding. You might have social conservatives who swing between the NDP and Andrew Scheer, like NDP and conservatives. You just got to convince them that the NDP has good left economic policy that speaks to them, and say that like, yeah, I get it. You don't support this social progressive issue. But the NDP is going to fight for working class people with pharmacare and dental care and things like that. And you got to back us. I mean, I don't know. Beyond that, though, I'm not an expert on flipping conservatives. I can't say more than that. Wait, missing a question? Or?
I'm just looking.
Okay.
Okay. Do you think the NDP has labor potential in Western Canada if they present the transition to green energy as inevitable?
I mean, I think there's the potential, but right now it does look like in places like Saskatchewan and Alberta, especially, that people are just lining up with the Conservatives. I don't know what the solution is. And it's like, I don't know how to reach these people because, like, you have the NDP offering a very bold Green New Deal, which is great. And, yeah, which is great. And, at the end of the day, like, it's going to be good for workers because a climate crisis will be awful for working class people. You know, rich people will be fine. They'll go live on their Elysium ring around the earth if it comes down to it, or their secret bunkers in New Zealand. Working class people will suffer. But you also have the Liberal Party who's buying pipelines and wants to build pipelines and is working harder to build pipelines than Stephen Harper ever did. And Rachel Notley worked super hard to build those pipelines, and they are not going to vote for them. So, like, I don't know. It seems like in Alberta and Saskatchewan, at least, they are so hardcore. They're voting Conservative, whether or not it's going to get them the pipeline or whether or not it's good for their children and grandchildren's futures. I don't know how to reach them. It looks like in this election, it's going to be really hard to crack the 2 of the 4 Western provinces, at least, for anybody but the Conservatives. It looks to get a real stranglehold. I don't know how to break it.
Okay, Zachary Galvine says, "What do you think of Justin Trudeau saying that Canada is on track to meet 2030 climate goals?"
I think it's misleading. There was a good CBC piece today that basically said as much. If you go look that up, there's a good CBC piece that said that it's likely the case that we're not on target for that. The Liberals might go faster and catch up, but on the current pace, we're not on target. We're not on target to meet those goals. And the Liberal climate plan that they've offered is not costed. And as Catherine McKenna noted, they're not going to figure out the details until after the election, meaning that I don't think they have any plans to actually do anything different. They're scared that the NDPers and Greens are not going to vote for them and they want their votes. So they're like, here's a climate plan. We're going to do this, even though it doesn't look like they can or will. So, yeah, I'm not convinced, and I don't think people will be.
Okay, Pierre is just joining us. Yet to put the kids to bed, and he wants to know if this will be available as a recording.
Yeah, I usually put them up pretty much right after. This one will be there. I don't think I'll put up the first half of this or the first little bit of this, which when the stream went down, because it was only about 10 minutes or so, and some of that was set up. So I'll likely put this up as soon as it processes, and you'll be able to watch it on demand. Yeah.
Okay, Stolen Coil says, "Every time I look at the polls, I get more and more depressed. But every time I see you talk, it's like we are seeing an NDP resurgence. Are you seeing something I'm not?"
The polls have been getting better. Again, some polls had us at 7 a couple weeks ago, and they now have us at 11 or 12. The polling average is stabling out. The numbers for Jagmeet Singh are getting better. The Liberals and Tories, neither of them are capitalizing on either scandals. And the chances of minority government now are much higher than they were 2 weeks ago, even. So all of those are very positive. And it's not just the polls. Jagmeet Singh was basically, people said Jagmeet won the first debate. Jagmeet Singh won campaign launch day. Quebec media and English Canadian media have been praising the NDP on this first couple weeks of the campaign. Jagmeet Singh was seen widely by people to have performed very well with the Justin Trudeau scandal, with the photos. On every front, Jagmeet Singh has been doing very well. It might take time for polling to manifest, though. That's because people still haven't made up their minds, but the NDP remains the second choice of a lot of parties, which is good. And if you look at the polling when that incident happened with, the Time magazine and the photos and all that, a majority of Canadians are not paying close attention to the election yet. They're still not really up in it. Like, more and more people are paying attention than they were a couple weeks ago, but most people are not in it right now. And so it might be the case that if he continues strong, when they do start paying attention, the numbers will start moving more quickly. So I'm again, yeah, you're right. The polls have not shown. It's not like the NDP is all of a sudden at 20 points, but things have been improving. And I think the narratives around Jagmeet Singh are very strong, whereas the narratives around Scheer and Trudeau and increasingly Elizabeth May are not as good.
Okay. So sorry guys, I just want to say that I'm like 5 minutes behind in the chat because I'm reading the questions. So I'll try to get rid of the trolls, but if you see some trolls and I haven't gotten rid of it yet, then please just don't feed them, and we'll try to ignore them until I get rid of them. Dip Helium says, should we treat Modi's India as an apartheid state as well for their actions in Kashmir, etc.? Were you listening?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, it's hard, right? I mean, it's a hard situation. I think I'm very concerned by Modi's India. I am. I see a dangerous trajectory happening there. It's hard to speak because India is, a longtime ally of Canada in many ways. We have a history together as British colonies and part of the Commonwealth. That history is important, but I'm very concerned about Modi's India, and don't want to legitimize what might happen there, especially to Sikhs and Muslims and non-Hindus broadly defined. I think that Jagmeet is right in noting, for instance, that Kashmiris deserve greater autonomy and self-determination. I think that's incredibly important, and I am very concerned about what's happening in India. I don't know if I could say more than that, if I'm being honest, because I don't know a whole lot more than that. But I do think that India's trajectory is a really troubling one. What happened in it's happening in the country, territories, semi-autonomous territories having their rights taken away, in Kerala and stuff. It's troubling. It's troubling what's happening in India, certainly.
Okay. Zachary Galvine says 338 local riding polls are problematic. Will you do a video about the problem with polling?
I might do a video with the problem with polling, but the challenge is I'm not strictly an expert on polling either. So if I'm going to go at something, I really want to have a firm grasp. I mean, one thing that's important to note is that most polling is not local. Some polling companies do local polls. Often they're private, like a riding association or party will commission a specific poll of a riding. It can be expensive to do, right? Like it's expensive to do a poll. And so most polling is regional, right? It's regional. It's like you'll do a poll of say 1,000 Canadians or 12,000 or 1,200 Canadians, and then you'll get the general data and maybe split it up into regions: Atlantic, Ontario, Quebec, maybe Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, and then the territories. And then like that's it. Like you won't often get local, and you could sometimes extrapolate that using formulas and historical knowledge to predict local results, but they are not local polls in the vast majority of cases. So it's important to know that.
Okay, Santok Sanini says, to any critically thinking Canadian, Jagmeet Singh's policies seem very obviously the best. Why is it taking Canada so long to catch on?
There's a whole bunch of reasons. One, I mean, the two big parties almost always get the most votes. That's often how it goes, and people often see it as like it's the two big parties versus one another, and the littler parties sort of get bullied out of the way in terms of coverage and in terms of analysis and in terms of attention. I think part of it also has to do with the fact that strategic voting is a reality for some people, and they are like, we're voting to stop Scheer. And I think some of it is racism. Some of it is that because of who Jagmeet Singh is, people aren't listening to him. I think part of it has to do, and this is something where the NDP could have done better, is Tom Mulcair should have quit the night after the election, and they should have had more time to rebuild. And having Mulcair stick on for so long and then having the long leadership contest meant that we spent far too much of the last 4 years not building towards the next election. And I think that, if Jagmeet Singh would have got elected a year earlier, maybe he would have had more time. I mean, these are all factors that matter. Some of it's media coverage. Linda McQuaig has noted that the NDP has a very popular wealth tax proposal, and the media has not really covered it except to criticize it. And even though it's extremely popular. So it's media, It's the party could have done a better job. It's the horse race. It's the strategic voting. It's all of these things. It's discrimination too.
Okay. Stolen Coil says, with first past the post still in place here, will our system continue to slip towards two-party dominance? Who do you think the two would be?
I don't know if it's going to slip towards two-party dominance. That's the theory of Canadian politics. And yet we've been a two-party system since 1919, and we've never stopped being one. Like, there's never been a time in federal politics since the First World War that there's only been two parties in the House of Commons. The Progressive Party existed, and then the CCF and Social Credit, and then there was the NDP, and then there was the Bloc, and the Reform Party, and now there's the Greens in the Bloc and the NDP, and now there's maybe even the PPC might be joining Parliament too. I don't know if I believe in Derverger's law, or however you pronounce it, that it trends towards a two-party system. In Canada, we haven't seen that. And in fact, in some provinces, we've seen that break down. Historically, provinces like New Brunswick and PEI were two-party provinces. There hadn't been minority governments in those provinces in generations because they only elected two parties almost ever. Like New Brunswick would elect one NDP MLA every now and then. But for the most part, it's a two-party province, and now each of those provinces has a major third party, whether it's the Greens in PEI or the Greens and the Provincial Alliance Party in New Brunswick. And so, if anything, I see people moving away from the two-party system in some parts of Canada.
Okay, Nathan Drake says, what do you think historically is the reason why Canada doesn't do coalition governments?
I mean, that's a great question. I think it could be rooted in part on the electoral system. It makes it less likely. It's more likely in systems that have some element of proportionality. For the first 30 years of Canada's history, it was just two parties. Maybe there was less of a need. I think that maybe it's influence of the American system. We see our politics as on election night, a party wins and a party loses, and the winner is whoever won election night, quote unquote. We don't see ourselves in that European model where unless some party has a clear big victory, then there's no real winner until the negotiations happen. As we're seeing in Israel right now, it's very unclear what's going to happen. Is Netanyahu still prime minister, or is it going to be Benny Gantz? We actually don't know. It looks like Netanyahu's going to get a chance to form government, but will he? I mean, I don't know, right? It's one of those things. So the reality is those issues have not, the American influence has played a big role in our system as well. Beyond that, though, I'm not quite sure, because there have been opportunities. I think in Canada, we use, except for World War I, where there was sort of a coalition of liberal, English Canadian liberals and the Conservative Party to form the quote unquote union government. There's not really been formal coalitions, but there has been a lot of supply and confidence deals, which is basically what's happening with BC right now, where one party governs and they require the support of another party. There's not a coalition because the entire government and cabinet is formed up by one party, but the smaller party gets greater influence than they normally would because they're upholding the government. This is, for example, the NDP and Liberals in the 60s where Medicare happened. Tommy Douglas held the minority balance of power, and there was no cabinet seats for the NDP, but they did have that supply and confidence deal.
Okay, Quinn M asks, do you think the short length of the campaign could affect the growing NDP support in a negative way?
I mean, I suppose that's a possibility. I mean, I think in 2015, for instance, the long campaign hurt the NDP. I felt if that campaign was a few weeks shorter, Tom Mulcair might be prime minister right now. And maybe that's a bit of a stretch, but I think if that election was literally 2 weeks shorter, it's a minority government. Justin Trudeau would not, he was starting to pull away, but if the election was even just a few days shorter, he would not have had enough time to get that majority support. You likely would have saw the NDP keep an extra 10, maybe even 15 seats and likely see the Liberals not win a majority. So timing of elections can really matter. But is this election the case where Jagmeet having not enough time, there's not enough runway for him to take off? Maybe, but it could also be the case that maybe it's going to turn out to be the perfect amount of time, and 2 more weeks could have seen Jagmeet make a mistake or lose momentum and hurt him. So, looking back on it, say a couple months from now, maybe we'll know, but it's impossible to say at this stage.
Okay, so that atheist says, regarding your answer to Western Canada and the Green New Deal, what do you think this means in terms of how states respond to worsening climate change?
I mean, I think it's going to show that like it's going to be really hard because not everyone is necessarily going to be on board with the changes needed. And it's going to be a question of how we can do it. And in Canada, you have the additional complexity of our federated system. What if certain provinces aren't down for it or certain regions aren't down for it? And I think that there are going to be some people, because it benefits them or benefits their community, will continue to deny the realities of climate change or will just acknowledge the realities and say they don't care. Like John Oliver, former finance minister, basically said, bring on climate change. It'll make Canada warmer. We'll be able to grow more crops. Whether or not that's true or not, I think climate scientists will say it's a heck of a lot more complicated than that. But basically, some of these people are like, bring on the climate change. Bring on the thing that will kill millions, especially in the developing world, if it helps Canada grow some bananas. So I think at some point we have to realize that there are some people who aren't climate change deniers. They're climate nihilists. They're climate, masochists, if you will, or sadists. And like, I don't know what the solution is there, but I think at some point we need to realize that like we're dealing with people who just will not change the system. And we have to find some way of doing it. And I think luckily the federal powers are strong in this regard. And I think at some point we'll have to challenge regions that will not get on board and use federal powers to do so.
Okay, Philip Rottingham says that he's just discovered the channel and that he's been binge watching the videos since the election. So that's kind of cool.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Every one of those views helps. Every one of those ad views helps. It's great to grow the channel. Thank you so much.
Oh, and Brandon is here and he says hi.
Brandon's here, said hi. I did a great video with Brandon a few weeks ago. We talked U.S. politics. If you look that up, Brandon Tozo, you could see a really good interview. It was my first interview. I've done some other ones with Aisha Janier, and I've also done one with Matthew Green as well.
Okay. Zachary Galvine says, Christo, do you believe in the idea of political cycles in which for the last 40 years we have been in conservative neoliberal era? Do you think that we are seeing the end of this cycle?
I mean, I don't know if I believe in the idea of cycles per se, like it's a preordained thing. Like every 40 years you switch from left wing to right wing. But I do think that we are approaching a new era. Like World War II, like the experience of the war combined with the experience of the Depression brought in a more progressive era, at least on economic terms, where people were more supportive of workers' organizations. They were more supportive of high taxation. They were more supportive of social programs and government intervention, what have you. And then 40 years of that led to a backlash and to a right-wing thing. And I think 40 years of that has realized, and people suffer, inequality is higher, precarity is a major issue, people can't afford housing or their medications, will lead to some new policies. Now, if this is a cycle and inevitably 40 years from now we'll shift back to the right again, that I can't predict. But I do think that we are approaching a potential new age of left-wing politics that we haven't had the opportunity to put forward since the 1980s. And I think that's incredibly important.
Okay, shout out to that atheist bastard. He says you're the best streamer on YouTube.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know.
We really appreciate your support.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I mean, I don't know if I'm the best streamer on YouTube. I mean, the Surfs are on Twitch now, and they're pretty good. So maybe I am now the best on YouTube, but I don't know. Well, we'll have to see. Maybe
let's just keep that ego in check. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Pierre Blinn says, would you be willing sometime to really break down the Green Environmental Plan versus the NDP Environmental Plan? Or even better, compare both with the LEAPS and 350 org Canada New Green Deal?
I could look into something like that. I mean, I've done some of that already. And it's like about balancing, doing a good deep dive when it's needed, but also not recreating the wheel. And as I've noted, my piece in the Washington Post does a little bit of this. I also want to be careful of taking too deep a dive where I'm not strictly an expert and on those issues. And it's also an issue of like, a very deep dive on that. Is that something that everyone wants to see? These are all things I have to balance, like viewership potential, my knowledge base. Have I touched on this somewhat before? And goes into what I do for my content. So I have a bit of a process like that. Now, that could very much be an interesting video, but I'm also right now looking less at the Greens than I have before, in part because I think as their polling subsided, I don't know if they merit quite the attention that they did a few weeks ago, but also like I'm looking at, comparing the NDP's plan largely to the Liberals and Conservatives, where I think those battlegrounds will be more realistic. So those are all things I'm factoring in. That's not to say no, but that's to say that like it's not necessarily a focus.
Okay, Santuk says, do you think Tom Mulcair respects Jagmeet? I get a weird vibe.
Whew, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure what the relationship is there. It's interesting. Tom Mulcair obviously probably still feels bitter. I don't blame him. I mean, I think it was the right move. I think we made the right move, but I don't blame Tom for being bitter about it. But it's not Jagmeet's fault. Jagmeet was not a coup maker. Jagmeet was I don't even know, was he even at that convention? I don't even remember. Like I don't know. I think that Mulcair is a little bit bitter. Some of the things he said about Jagmeet have been unfair, I think, since the election and what he said about the NDP. I don't think it's right for a former NDP leader to go on the media and basically talk trash about the party. I get it. He's now an independent political commentator, but you know how the news works. They're still counting him as like the NDP guy. And so the NDP guy goes on, says something bad about the NDP, and then the news is like, well, we included our token one NDP of this week, right? And like, it concerns me. On the other hand, I think even in the last few weeks, he's written some pieces now. I guess he's a columnist for the Toronto Sun, at least a little bit. And he's written something about Jagmeet doing a little bit better. So maybe Mulcair is warming up to him. But I mean, I don't think it strictly matters what Mulcair thinks all that much, at least not right now.
Okay, I like Google Plus says, what specifically are your issues with Canada Greens compared to the NDP?
Well, I have a whole bunch of issues with the Greens. I don't know their position on women's rights. I don't know their position on a whole bunch. I don't really know their position on pipelines. I don't know their position on separatism. I'm not even really anti-separatist, like in a way that like a lot of English Canadians are. Like it's complicated. Like I'm not a separatist, but like I also get that Quebec has those people, and I don't automatically disparage them. But I'd like to know where you stand. Like I also think that their positions on Indigenous people have been very weak. If you look at my video this afternoon where I compared the demographics of all the parties, the Green Party is running the least diverse slate of candidates in terms of racialized people. The Greens do okay on women and LGBTQ peoples. They're behind the NDP. The NDP runs the most diverse slate on pretty much every metric. But the Greens are running not a diverse slate that reflects Canada. Robert Jago has written some really good pieces about the Green Party's ignorance at best on Indigenous people. Their positions on workers are troubling. What we've seen from Green parties in power when they've had seats provincially is that they fought against workers' rights whenever they really could, whether it's Mike Schreiner, whether it's Andrew Weaver. There's a whole bunch of reasons why I don't support the Green Party. And I feel at the end of the day that while their climate plan, besides the NDP, is the only one that might actually be good, it doesn't connect to broad economic justice. And I can't support them. And even on other things, like I noted earlier, the Greens want to, like the NDP wants to decriminalize drug use because that's the right thing to do. The Greens want to do it, but only temporarily. Like, what is that? Like, what are you, Green Party? Like, like, let me know what you are. And some people like a decentralized politics, but I think like I want to know what I'm voting, what I'm getting when I'm voting for it. And with the Greens not whipping votes, I could never know what I'm getting. These are all things that, and the Green Party, at least somewhat, using, I would say, racially motivated justifications to poach members from the NDP. Some of the new Greens suggesting that the NDP can't win because of their leader, and that's why we're going to the Greens, is icky at the very least. Are you okay?
Kyle and Chicha says, honestly, Christo, even if the NDP is the best option, I feel the party system in general has failed us just like it has in the US. I'd like to see a push for more independence if it wasn't for how things are set up.
I mean, I think that's perfectly legitimate. I mean, there are challenges to political. Like, I mean, the U.S. system has far more independence than our system. Like the ability for a congressman or congresswoman or senator to vote against their party in the US is much, much higher. And yet their system is broken. The US system, more than almost any other political system, gives more independence to their individual their individual elected officials. You can have Democrats voting for it and with Donald Trump almost all the time, and they're still Democrats. You'll have them vote against core issues like women's rights and workers' rights, and they're still Democrats. And you'll have Republicans basically call for impeachment, and they're still Republicans, right? Like, there's that independence in their system, and it's still broken. In terms of like moving beyond parties, I mean, I'm skeptical, but maybe there are ways that with digital technology we could include citizens on more votes. But I don't know if you'll ever replace the need for parties, unless you're talking about very, very small scale government, like very, very small areas with small populations. I just thought that's my view.
Okay, I think we'll probably go for another 15 minutes until 11, and I think we'll have enough.
Okay. So we're going to go till 11, guys. So about 15 more minutes. So we're going a little bit longer because of the technical issues. But we'll go till about then. And then
and then hopefully we'll get to everyone. But
yeah.
If not, join us next time.
Yeah.
Okay. Pillsby Andy Dubois says, is there a minimum number of seats Jagmeet Singh needs to win in order to stay on as leader? That should be a nice, quick question.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that a seat number is far less important than context. Does he hold the balance? Where are the seats? Is there a sense of what was the vote total? Was he punished primarily because he lost a bunch of votes or because of the vagaries of first past the post? I think a big factor is balance of power and party status are going to be important, though. I think I'm not saying he loses his leadership with less than 12, but keeping party status will be a major factor.
So the short answer was no.
Maybe.
Okay.
Maybe.
Zachary Galvin.
Do people like when you guys like when Brianna roasts me live on the internet? Look, let me know in the comments.
I enjoy it.
Yeah.
I think that's
Brianna enjoys it, but yeah.
Okay.
Anyway. Yeah.
You're mean. Zachary Galvin says, do you think that when you talk about climate nihilism that it may cause the rise of eco-fascism?
Maybe. I mean, I don't know if like the nihilism links to that, but I do think that there is the possibility that right-wing forces, once they realize that denial and obstinance on climate isn't going to work anymore, will try to co-opt it. They'll tie in climate change to anti-immigration issues. They'll tie it into population control. They'll tie it into eugenics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's the bigger risk. They'll try to lock in and increase existing inequalities using climate change as an excuse. And that's what I think might happen in the future. It doesn't look, again, like that's going to happen yet, because conservative movements are still in the, we deny climate change. Either we deny the science or we deny that we need to do anything about it. But that could change over the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Okay, the Great Dominion says, does the Liberal Party of Canada have a future? And if so, who will lead it?
I mean, in terms of like, is the Liberal Party still going to be around? I mean, I don't know. I mean, the Liberal Party almost like took a beating in 2011, but then won again. I would say that even if like the Liberal Party stayed in third in 2015 and the NDP won and we implemented electoral reform, the Liberal Party would have likely stayed around to be something like the Lib Dems in Britain, sort of like a left-wing or like a right-wing neoliberal party with some left-wing social issues, trying to catch, centrist Tories and things like that. In terms of what their future is under this system, I mean, I don't know. I can't make that prediction. But I mean, the next leader for the Liberal Party, whether or not I think they would be a good leader or the best leader, personally, is irrelevant. I think the next candidates for Liberal leader are going to be people like Chrystia Freeland. I think she's probably the favorite for the next leader for the Liberal Party for a bunch of reasons. One, she remains quite popular even as Justin Trudeau's numbers have fallen. Whether or not you agree, a lot of people say she's done a great job handling Trump, handling trade negotiations, Canada's space in the world. She's also a woman. The Liberal Party is the only party in this country to have been exclusively led by white men. like the only major federal party. The Greens have had one woman leader. The NDP have had two women and a person of color. The Conservatives, if you link them back to the PCs, which I do because they were just a remerger of that party, had Kim Campbell as their leader.
That was an accident, though.
Irrelevant. The Liberals are the only, well, not irrelevant.
That is not irrelevant. They didn't vote for her. It was an accident.
Well, the party picked her. The party picked her. The people did not pick her. But here's the thing. At the end of the day, I think the Liberals are going to want to go with a not white man. And one thing the Liberal Party does, at least they've been doing since the days of Laurier, is they've alternated between French and English Canadian prime minister leaders of the Liberal Party. So when Laurier French, King English, Saint Laurent French, Pearson English, Trudeau French, Turner English, Chrétien French, Paul Martin English, Dion French, Ignatieff English, Trudeau French. He's bilingual, but he's from Quebec. He's Francophone. And now the Liberals will almost certainly pick an Anglophone leader. And so that's why it's likely going to be Freeland. I think if I missed, let me know if I got that Liberal ordering right. I think I was correct there.
Okay, Philip Roddenham says, Christo, I saw someone in my riding with a Green Party sign and a Liberal Party sign on their lawn. What do you think is up with that? And Nathan and Zachary have both suggested that it's a split household.
Yeah, it could be a split household. There's a few factors. If it's like a single family dwelling, it could still be a split. Like the husband and wife or the kids and the parents have different views. There was a really great sign. Remember in the provincial election where the dad put out a Doug Ford sign or a conservative sign on his lawn. And then the daughter put a little note on the corner of the sign saying, the daughter of this house supports Andrea Horwath. And it was this great little moment. Because young women tried to save us in that election and we let them down. They all voted NDP and we let them down. But another factor is it could be a rental units. Like if there are like a basement unit, it could be like different parts of the household have different signs. Another factor is, I don't know if this is everywhere, but I know in Ontario at least, landlords can put up signs on their property, even if they're rented out by people. They can't tell their tenants to not put up signs. So what could happen is your landlord could be a Liberal or a Conservative and put a sign on every one of their lawns. But then the tenants in those places could choose to put up a different sign. And that's sometimes how it works as well. So all of those could be factors. But split household is probably the correct response.
Quinn M says, can you say anything on how lifting people out of poverty will help the country as a whole, the people, productivity, wealth, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Like the people, the productivity, like poverty is expensive, not just for the people. Like being poor is expensive. Your medical bills you can't afford because you don't have insurance. You can't afford to buy cheap food in bulk. You might not have good equipment at your house to freeze stuff. Like being poor is expensive, but having a bunch of poor people in your society is expensive for your society. Minor health issues become major health issues. People who lack education and good, stable home lives are less likely to be productive and more likely to be institutionalized. So I think that when you invest in healthcare and education and in social services, and when you just, help people who need money with money, you build a better society. And I think that that's certainly something we need to work for. When the lowest person, not lowest, that sounds awful, but when the poorest people in our society are better taken care of, it will create a better life for everybody. The economy will be stronger. The tax base will be stronger. There will be less issues with crime and mental health, concerns. 100%. If we work together, we'll build a better society. And we do that by helping the least fortunate people.
Okay. Everyone approves of my roasting. So
okay. Good to know, guys. Thanks, guys.
So there you go.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Mark from Canada says, after watching an interview with Sean Penn, is it time for someone that is 51 to just leave this vote up to the younger generation? I have decided to give up on this voting thing.
I mean, I don't know about that. I do think that young people need to go and cast their ballots. And I'm not judging the older folks in this space. If you're watching this, odds are you're probably voting in a progressive direction. But if you look at how the boomer generation and older vote, they vote very conservatively. And I'm not like one of these people like we got to stop boomers from voting. But I do think that young people need to go out and vote. Right now, millennials are the biggest potential voting bloc. If everybody went to vote, millennials would have more votes than boomers or anybody else, or Gen Xers or whatever. Millennials need to actually get to the polls and vote. If they do, more progressive governments will get elected. I don't think, though, that older people need to leave their votes behind. I think progressive older folks, if they want to help, get your children, your grandchildren, your nieces and nephews, your cousins, whatever, your family friends, get them to the polls. You know, on average, they will be progressive. Not always, but young women especially are extremely progressive. Every time you get a young woman to the poll, it's like there's like a 0% chance she's a conservative. And it's like the most likely that she's like an NDPer. Like, you know, simple as that.
Okay, shout out to TMST. Thank you so much for your support.
Thank you again.
And we will get to your question before the stream. Stream
Make sure to get to that one.
Yep. Oh, okay, hold on. I lost my spot. Okay. Pillsbury Andy Doughboy. I can't read that. I know what it's trying to.
Is it Pillsbury Doughboy?
I know. Well,
or is it a play on that word?
It's a play on it, but I just can't say it. Okay. Can you explain the whole voting strategically thing? Is it really a concern?
Well, to keep it relatively short and sweet, I mean, voting strategically is the basic idea is that you vote to keep a certain party out of power by backing the party most likely to do it. That's how it manifests in Canada. It's often also called anything but conservative voting. So what you do is you say, look, in these ridings, this party is most likely to defeat the Conservatives, so we should all vote for that party. And if we do that, we'll elect we'll stop the bad government from coming, even if we don't get a good government. Now, whether or not everyone votes strategically or whether or not people understand how it actually works is a big question. Some people think strategic voting is just voting for Liberals everywhere, when in many ridings, it's important to vote NDP because they're most likely to be the Conservatives, or the Liberal Party is like the NDP and Liberals actually compete, so there's no need for strategic voting. But yes, strategic voting has been historically an issue that limits the success of smaller parties, not just in Canada, but everywhere else. 100%. 100% it's an issue. And it will be an issue in this election, but not necessarily one that can't be overcome.
Okay, TMST says, have you seen This Hour Has 22 Minutes? Have you seen This Hour Has 22 Minutes skit? Canadians need another option. It's a humorous yet realistic picture of Canadians not really aware of the NDP as a viable option.
Yep, I have. Yeah, it's really great. That was actually like it was I think a pretty positive portrayal, and I think Jugmeat again did very well. His media hits, especially his alternative ones, have been really great. Tout le monde en parle, Nardoir, This Hour Has 22 Minutes. He's been great on all of these alternative media hits, and it's really showing that he's like a fun guy, right? Like that he's having fun, that he's relatable, and I think that was a good little moment. And I know it was like poking fun at the NDP, but I think you're right. I think a lot of people, for whatever reason, just aren't taking the NDP seriously. And that could hurt us, but it could also mean that they're coming around. When they come around, they're going to see this young, fresh face and be excited.
Zachary Galvine says, we need to lower the voting age to 16. Then more young people will vote, because if we engage kids in high school, they will be more likely to vote long-term.
Is that, you look, 100%. I think that, if you start voting at 16, that means most kids will start voting in grade 10 or 11, depending on when their birthday is. Most kids will start voting before almost all kids will vote before they leave high school. And you can make sure that in every high school in this country that you will have a polling booth there. So in their kids' first eligible election, they will be very likely to vote. And I think that's incredibly important. And you'll instill the habit, you'll instill the importance, you'll give that civics class for students greater relevance. They'll all understand it much better. I think it's 16 for me is a good voting age. Some people have suggested lower. I'm not against that, but I think that in terms of what people would accept, I think that you could convince Canadians, at least enough of them, that 16-year-old voting is a good thing. 16-year-olds can work. They can go to jail. 17, you can join the military. What is it? You're like months away from being able to serve your country. If you have a job, you pay taxes. To me, it's 16-year-olds should have the right to vote. 100%.
Okay. And our last question.
All right.
Is from A's. What are some of your book recommendations to learn more about leftist politics?
Well, I mean, in terms of Canada, I have a lot of books here on my shelf. I will do at some point a book tour. People have asked for it, but it might not come till after the election because there's so much immediate content we have to cover. If you want to understand, a good book is Rebels, Reds, Radicals by Ian Mackay, gives a good understanding of the Canadian left. There's a good book, Working Class Experience by Brian Palmer, is a good broad labor history. I have, my book on Pierre Trudeau might be something you want to read because it's a good broad history of the Canadian left after World War II. What are some other good books? If you want to read like Beyond Canada, like Zinn's, like the hero history of the American, like
the history of the working class.
Yeah, like E.P. Thompson's book is really good for that. What are some other good histories? Historians like Greg Keeley, Linda Keeley, Joan Sangster, Craig Heron have all written really good books. There's a really good book by Jim Naylor that's a really good look at the history of the early CCF, which people might like. If you like stuff on the Communist Party, there's books by Ian Angus, which are really good. There hasn't been like a recent study on the Communist Party like that I know of, but they're good books by Ian Angus. There's a ton of books. What would be easier? I've done some recommendations in some places. Is like, if you ever have questions about books, send me a note. I'd be happy to, like, what you're interested in, and I'd be happy to offer a quick few suggestions. Okay.
Okay, it's pronounced Pills Bandy Doughboy, and it's a Trailer Park reference.
Yes.
Did you know that as soon as I was?
Yes, I did. Yeah. Pills Bandy Doughboy. Yes. As you see, I mean, I love the Trailer Park Boys. I mean, I grew up in the Maritimes. I grew up in Moncton, which is where one of the deals goes down. No, I'm telling my little trailer park. And I grew up in a trailer park. I did. I from the age of about 7 till I left for university, I lived in a trailer park. And so it was always an interesting show. At first, I didn't like it because they thought they were making fun of people like me, and maybe they were. But then I realized that the show ultimately portrays most of the people in the park as misguided, though ultimately like honorable people in their own ways. And I think that it's a very interesting anthropological study of the Eastern Canadian lumpen proletariat, and it's also funny.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for your questions.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. Again, thanks for all your support. Just as a reminder, we're doing this every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock from now until the Wednesday after the election, after which we might go back to a every 2-week schedule, or we might stay weekly, again, depending on the reception and things like that. Again, I have to say, thus far, the reception's been really good. So I'm leaning towards continuing it, but we'll wait and see until then. As always, I put up videos on this channel that deal with Canadian politics and American politics and other issues. I had that video about Greta Thunberg. So if you haven't seen this channel before, if you don't watch a lot of the regular videos, go check those out. Of course, the best way you can support this channel is through watching and sharing the content, but you can also support me on Patreon. Supporting there really helps to improve the quality and quantity of content on this channel. It's the reason why I have this nice fancy microphone that I didn't have before. It's thanks to my patrons and my supporters. So guys, thanks again so much. I will see you next week. And I will see you for the rest of the week in videos on social media and what have you. Have a good one, guys.
Thanks for stopping by.